All right, good morning, everyone. This is our third of 5 sessions, so we're at the halfway point of our rules review sessions, and after this morning, we will be a little bit more than halfway through the rules book. So today, excuse me, we will resume with Rule 11. As you recall, last week we talked about Rule 9, which dealt with various situations involving a ball at rest that is moved. Now with Rule 11, we're going to talk about a ball in motion that is deflected. And as we'll see, this rule is broken down into two parts, accidental deflections and deliberate actions, and that yield very different results. We do not have any definitions to start with, but let's look at the purpose statement of the rule. This rule covers what to do if the ball in motion hits a person, animal, equipment, or anything else. When this happens accidentally, there's no penalty, and the player normally must accept the result. Now, whenever we see a word like normally, something that's not absolute, we know that that is not absolute. We know that there are going to be exceptions to that statement. And it goes on to say Rule 11 also restricts a player from deliberately taking actions to affect where a ball in motion might come to rest. And under it, a useful statement that this rule applies anytime a ball is in motion, except when it has been dropped and has not yet come to rest, which is covered by Rule 14.3, which Dan will go over later this morning. Rule 11.1, ball in motion accidentally hits person or outside influence. As Dan has pointed out before, the rules have very descriptive and helpful titles to the rules. For example, just look at 11.1a, no penalty to player, and 11.1b, place from where ball must be played. Very simple and straightforward that helps the reader get to the right place. So the first point, with an accidental deflection, there's no penalty to the player, even if, and we're going to see a few of these even ifs today, even if the ball hits the player, the opponent, or any other player. So that's just for emphasis to say that there's no penalty for an accidental deflection by the player. So if I hit a bunker shot, the ball hits the lip of the bunker, comes back and strikes me, there's no penalty. In the next section, we'll see where I play the ball from, but right now all we're concerned about is whether there's a penalty, and there is no penalty. But there is one exception to that, and it's a very narrow one, and it applies only in stroke play and only when the player's ball was on the putting green and the other ball involved was on the putting green. And that is if a player plays from the putting green and strikes another ball at rest on the putting green, when both balls were originally on the green, the player is going to get 2 penalty strokes. So remember, this is only in stroke play. And the reason for this penalty is just to give the player who's putting every incentive to have that ball, that the other ball, which might be in a position to assist him, to have that ball lifted, because this way it's in the player's own interest not to strike that other ball, and therefore not to be able to use that other ball as a backstop. So no penalty except in that one case. Now, if this happens, we have an accidental deflection, where does the player play from? First part of 11.1b talks about when the ball is played from anywhere except on the putting green. So for the vast majority of the course, this will be the case. Ball in motion played from anywhere except the putting green accidentally hits any person, even the player, or an outside influence, the ball must normally be played as it lies. But if the ball comes to rest on any so first, let's stop there, because that first sentence is going to cover 95% of all deflections. Normally, play the ball as it lies. So for example, you hit a a player hits a tee shot, hits a spectator, play the ball as it lies, no penalty, and play the ball from where it winds up, whether good or bad. The time the player would not play the ball as it lies would be if it comes to rest on a person, animal, or moving outside influence. For example, the ball comes to rest in a spectator's pocket, something it seems that we see on TV maybe once or twice a year. Or let's say a dog picks up a ball, or the ball comes to rest in a like a moving golf cart. So in those cases, let's see how the player will proceed. If the ball comes to rest on any person, animal, moving outside influence anywhere except on the putting green, the player must drop the original ball or another ball in this relief area. And the relief area is determined by the reference point, which is the point right under where the ball first came to rest in or on that person. So, for example, if a ball lodges in a player's pocket and then he feels like he's been stung by a bee and runs away, the reference point is going to be where that spectator was standing when the ball came to rest in his pocket. And then so you're going to estimate the point right under where that ball first came to rest in the spectator's pocket. And then from there, the player is going to get one club length. But that one club length has to be in the same area of the course. So if it's in the general area, must still be in the general area and must not be nearer the hole than the reference point. Okay, now if the ball comes to rest on a person, animal, or moving outside influence that's located on the putting green. So even though we're talking about the putting green, remember that the stroke itself was played from off the putting green. But let's say that the person that the ball, whose pocket the ball came to rest in, was on the putting green. Then the player must place the original or another ball on the estimated spot right under where the ball first came to rest on that person. Notice there is no club length, that the player is going to place it right on that estimate spot right under where the ball came to rest in that person. All right, so then what happens? That's when clause 1 covers when the stroke was made from anywhere except the putting green. Now what happens if the stroke was made from the putting green? And we're going to, as we'll see, different results. If a player's ball in motion played from the putting green accidentally, remember, we're still talking about accidental deflections, hits the player or an outside influence, the ball must normally be played as it lies. But if it's known or virtually certain that the ball hits any of the following that are located on the putting green, and that's a subtle point, located on the putting green, the player must replay the stroke by playing the original ball or another ball from the spot where that stroke was made. So any person other than the player or the person attending the flagstick. So in other words, what would be the ruling if a player putts the ball from very close to the hole, the ball horseshoes around the hole and comes back and hits his foot? Would this apply? And the answer is no, it would not apply. So we know from the start of this rule that there's no penalty, but the player will wind up playing the ball as it lies. But if it strikes, say, someone else, then the player who is not attending the flagstick, the player would be required to replay the stroke. Same if the ball strikes a movable obstruction other than the club the player used. So a similar result if the ball horseshoed around the hole, struck the player on the toe. If the ball horseshoed around the hole, struck the player's putter, it would be the same result. If it struck a ball marker, player's going to play as it lies. And if it strikes another ball at rest, the player's going to play the ball from where it comes to rest. Now, an animal, except those defined as a loose impediment. So, for example, if a player putts and the ball strikes a squirrel, he is going to be required to replay. but if he putts and strikes, say, an insect, he is not required to replay and is required to play the ball as it lies. Now, a couple of things to note how this is different from the previous revision, the previous rule cycle. One, that a lot of this rule is very similar to the subsequent model local rule that committees were able to adopt the last couple of years, that kind of tightens up the situations in which the player is required to replay the stroke, but also the fact the end here. If the player replays the stroke but does so from the wrong place, they get the general penalty. And in this next part is completely new and different. If the player does not replay the stroke, they get the general penalty and the stroke counts, but the player has not played from the wrong place. So let's go over an example or two of that and how that can be important. Let's say a player putts and his putt is deflected he's 30 feet from the hole. His putt's deflected by a squirrel. The ball winds up 1 inch from the hole. Then the player, not knowing that he was required to replay, taps in the 1 inch putt. Now, if it's match play, what's the ruling? Player was required to replay the stroke. He didn't, so he's going to lose the hole. So that's straightforward. Stroke play, though, is going to be different, because in stroke play, the player is going to get the 2-stroke penalty. He's going to count the stroke that he made from 30 feet, and then he's going to count the stroke that he made from 1 inch. But this last part that says the player has not played from the wrong place, what's the significance of that? That means that if he's not played from the wrong place, he cannot have committed a serious breach of playing from the wrong place. So that means even when he goes from 30 feet to 1 inch, that's not a serious breach of playing from the wrong place, and therefore he is not looking at the threat of disqualification. So that is very different from the way it was the previous several years. And again, we're intentionally kind of not talking about the way the rule used to be, and instead focusing on the way the rule is. So just notice that it's a requirement to replay the stroke, and if the player does not do so, then the stroke counts and the player gets the general penalty, but he's not played from the wrong place. Now, moving on to 11.2, we're going to shift gears, and for the next 2 sections talk about deliberate actions, whether by the player or someone else. When does Rule 11.2 apply? This rule applies only when it's known or virtually certain that a player's ball in motion was deliberately deflected or stopped by a person. So we're talking about a person, but look at these 2 bullet points, especially the second one. First is a person deliberately touches the ball in motion. I see a ball that looks like it's going to go into a penalty area. I intentionally stick my hand out or my foot out to stop it. That's a deliberate deflection. Now, the second bullet point's a little more subtle. That says that a deliberate deflection occurs also when the ball in motion hits any equipment or other object, except a ball marker or another ball at rest, or any person, including the player's caddy, that a player deliberately positioned. So if the player deliberately told his caddy, or let's say he put his sand wedge down on the fringe of the green to say, if I hit this putt too hard, that sand wedge will keep the ball from rolling into the river. That would be an example of a deliberate deflection. Or if the player has left that item or that person in a particular location so that the equipment, object, or person might deflect or stop the ball in motion. So let's look at interpretation 11.2a/1 on the bottom of page 157, because that has a good example and helps explain what is meant by the latter part of that sentence about leaving something in a particular location. So with 11.2a/1, Rule 11.2 applies to a situation where a player did not initially position the equipment, object, or person for the purpose of deflecting the ball, but the player then realizes that it might deflect or stop the ball after positioning it and deliberately leaves it there. And that, so that's important that if the player, for example, well, we'll go through an example where the player gets a penalty. After raking a bunker, player places the rake between the green and the bunker without any thought of it influencing the ball. The player now has a downhill putt toward the bunker, and he says, gee, that rake might stop my ball. And the player goes ahead and putts without removing the rake. So that would be a penalty. While he did not initially position the rake there for the purpose of potentially deflecting the ball, the keys are that one, the player had put the rake there himself, and that two, before he played, he did think, that might assist me. I'm going to leave it there. Second example where there is not a penalty is when a rake has been left by a group in front. And then the player has a similar downhill putt and says, gosh, my lucky day, that rake is in a good place. If this putt gets away from me, it'll stop my ball from going into the bunker. In that case, there's no penalty because even though the player deliberately left the rake there, the player had not initially physically put the rake in that location. So a subtle but important distinction there. Let's see, going back to the rule, and we now have an exception. And this is something that Dan covered a couple of weeks ago in Rule 3, and just a reminder of that in match play, if an opponent's ball in motion is deliberately deflected or stopped, when there's no reasonable chance it can be holed, and when it's done either as a concession or when the ball needed to be holed to tie the hole, then Rule 3 applies, which will say there's no penalty for the deliberate deflection in those circumstances. All right, Rule 11.2b. So we've talked about now when this rule applies. Now let's talk about when the player gets a penalty. Player gets the general penalty if they deliberately deflect or stop a ball in motion. So notice that is outcome based. So when the player actually does the deflection. So if a player sees this ball rolling back toward him and tries to and sticks out his foot for the purpose of stopping the ball, but the ball does not actually strike his foot, he's not in breach because he did not actually deflect the ball in motion. And that's one thing we'll see in several places throughout the rules where sometimes there's a rule only if the actual incident happens, and then sometimes when, okay, the desired outcome might not have happened, but the intent of the player to do so was enough to warrant a penalty. And there's not necessarily a great rule of thumb as to which situation applies, but it's just helpful to know that there are those two different approaches. And when reading one of those rules, just go slowly through to discern whether it's outcome based or intent based. All right, so we say the player gets the general penalty. This is true whether it's the player's own ball or a ball played by an opponent in match play or another player in stroke play. So if a player deliberately deflects a ball in motion, whether it's his ball or another player's ball, he is going to be penalized. The exception we touched on under Rule 10 last week is that the player is allowed to lift their moving ball in water, whether it's in temporary water or a penalty area when taking relief, because we talked about how the player is allowed to play a moving ball in those circumstances. So it follows that the player is also allowed to lift a moving ball in those circumstances. All right, 11.2C. So we've talked about when this rule applies, when there's a penalty. Now we're going to look at where the player who played the shot will play the next stroke from. Now, if it's known or virtually certain the ball in motion was deliberately deflected or stopped by a person, it must not be played as it lies. So we know that with deliberate deflections, the player is not going to play the ball as it lies. Which is obviously very different from accidental deflections. So let's look at how the player will proceed, and it will depend as to where that stroke was made. If it was made from anywhere except the putting green, the player is going to take relief based on the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest if not deflected or stopped. So there is some judgment required here. So for example, if a player's ball is going over the putting green and a spectator behind the green deliberately swats the ball back onto the putting green, the player or referee is going to have to determine, okay, if the ball had not hit that been deliberately deflected by that spectator, where would the ball have come to rest? So the player must determine that, and then it's going to drop the original ball or another ball in this relief area. Reference points the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest without that deliberate deflection. Then the player is going to get one club length from that, but in the same area of the course and not near the hole. Now, the exception to this is as if the ball would have come to rest in a penalty area. So if a ball
Oh, crap.
let's see, can you hear me now? Hello? When did my sound cut off? Do I need to back up much?
Hey, John. John, why don't you start back over with 11.2C?
Oh, okay. So, sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
No problem.
All right, 11.2C. So now we have talked about, when this rule applies, when there's a penalty. Now we'll talk about where the player will play the next stroke from. When there's a deliberate deflection. If the stroke was made from anywhere other than on the putting green, so let's say we're talking about an approach shot, the player is going to take relief based on the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest if it had not been deliberately deflected. So if a ball heading over a putting green is deliberately deflected by a spectator, the player, the referee, is going to have to exercise some judgment as to where that ball would have come to rest if that deliberate deflection had not taken place. And then once that spot is estimated, the player gets one club length from there in the same area of the course, for example, the general area, and not near the hole than that estimated spot. The exception to that is, let's say the ball was heading toward a pond, a penalty area, and a spectator deliberately deflected the ball. The player does not have to go drop the ball in 5 feet of water in the pond and then proceed. Rather, if the player wants to instead directly take penalty area relief. With a penalty stroke under Rule 17, the player may, but in that case, the player would still need to estimate where the ball would have last crossed the edge of the penalty area if the spectator had not deliberately deflected the ball. So now we'll talk about what happens when the stroke was made. We're still saying the stroke was made from off the putting green, but it's clear that the ball would have come to rest on the putting green. So perhaps we're talking about a chip shot. In this case, the player is going to place the original or another ball on the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest using the procedures under Rule 14.2. So let's say a chip shot was deliberately deflected, and it's clear the ball would have come to rest on the putting green. The player is going to estimate where it would have come to rest on the putting green and place a ball right on that spot, so no club length. Now, if the ball would have come to rest out of bounds, so let's say, a player hits a tee shot toward a boundary, the spectator, for whatever reason, intentionally deflects that ball back toward the fairway so it won't go out of bounds. The player, it's not his lucky day. The player still has to proceed as if the ball went out of bounds and take stroke and distance relief. Now, if the stroke had been made from the putting green, so now the ball is on the putting green and the player putts and the ball is deliberately deflected, the player is going to be required to replay the stroke by playing the original or another ball from the spot where he just putted from. As we saw under 11.1, if the player replays but does so from the wrong place, then they get the general penalty. If the player does not replay, they get the general penalty and the stroke counts, but the player has not played from the wrong place, just as we saw before under 11.1. All right, now 11.3, which still deals with deliberate actions to affect a ball in motion, but the nature of those actions is going to change a little bit. When a ball is in motion, a player must not deliberately take any of these actions to affect where that ball, whether it's the player's ball or someone else's ball, might come to rest. So this is what the player may not do, may not alter physical conditions by taking any of the actions listed way back in Rule 8.1a, such as replacing a divot or pressing down raised turf, or lifting or removing a loose impediment or movable obstruction. Normally a player is allowed to remove a loose impediment or movable obstruction, but as Dan will talk about in Rule 15, players not allowed to do that for the purpose of influencing a ball in motion. Now, the player is in breach of this rule for taking these deliberate actions, even if the action does not affect where the ball came to rest. So this is different. So now this is not an outcome-based breach. Rather, this is an intent-based breach. So if a player moves a loose impediment for the purpose of influencing the ball in motion, even if the ball stops short of where the loose impediment had been, or if the ball passes to the side of where the loose impediment had been, the player would be penalized. So different penalty trigger there. There is an exception that's fairly far-reaching, is that this rule does not prohibit a player from lifting or moving a removed flagstick. And that's important. Player putts, sees the ball, his ball is speeding past the hole toward a flagstick line on the green. Is it okay for his caddy to remove that flagstick? Yes, it is. A ball at rest on the putting green may be lifted while another ball is in motion. But with this, it's important to keep in mind that if the player lifts his ball from the putting green, he's still obligated to mark its spot. So he needs to be he really needs to be on his toes to avoid penalty completely in that case. and any equipment belonging to anyone may be removed while a ball is in motion. So, for example, if Dan putts too strongly, his ball's going past the hole and it looks like it might hit my wedge lying on the ground, I can run over and remove my wedge while the ball is in motion. All right, so that is Rule 11. Like I said, the main thing here is the distinction between accidental and deliberate acts. And then once you make that determination, that will tell us whether there's a penalty. And then we look to see where the player will play their next stroke from. Any questions on Rule 11?
John, we do have one online regarding 11-2A, one clarification. May an opponent or fellow competitor remove the rake? Is the question. Dealing with equipment left in position.
The rake, is that like the rake left by the previous group? In that case, it will depend. If the player himself, for example, Jeff, if you and I are playing together and I'm about to putt and there's a rake that was left by, let's say, a previous group, and you think to yourself, John has hammer hands and there's a good chance this putt's going to get away from him, might go in the bunker, and that rake might stop him. That would, I'm going to go move that rake. You can do that unless when I see what you're about to do, I say, Jeff, don't move that rake. I want that rake to stay there. Then if I say that, then you cannot move it. But otherwise, that would be okay to do.
Okay. Got one more. It says exception to 11.3 only permits players to move. What about a spectator?
Well, and I think the way to look at it is, so if a spectator were to remove, let's say, or remove flagstick, that would be permissible for a couple of reasons. One, because the player himself is allowed to do that. It would not, when we look back to Rule 1, it would not be a breach, since it would not be a breach of the rules for the player to do that. It would be okay for someone else to do it. And also, just in general, it's hard to penalize spectators. The only person who could be penalized is a player. And since the player himself could remove that flagstick, it would follow that the player would not be penalized if a spectator did so. Okay, all right, on to...
We got one more,
okay.
John, sorry.
John, a player's on the putting green, has a downhill putt, like this example in the clarification. He puts his golf bag, say, next to the fringe because there's a big slope there, and he thinks it's either going to go into a bunker and or a penalty area. If he puts that ball, and say the ball ends up right next to the hole, the bag doesn't have any influence, is there still a penalty because there was intent there, or does it have to hit the golf bag in order to trigger that penalty?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm guessing that was Jim asking that, and that would be that would be a breach because that was a deliberate action. The player. I'm sorry. You're talking about when the player. Okay, sorry. So now we're back to 11.2 rather than 11.3, and in that case, that is an outcome-based rule, which means if that deflection does not actually take place, there is no penalty.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
John, this was the last one we'll take on this from online. It's the question reads, player sculls a greenside bunker shot and ball is deflected by another player standing on the green to defend himself from being hit. Do we play the ball where it lies after the deflection?
Okay, so there's a bunker shot, ball is accidentally deflected by someone standing on the putting green. So the key is that we have to say, okay, would that ball have come to rest on the putting green? And I'm guessing the answer is no, that it would have gone across the putting green. So in that case, the player would wind up playing the ball from where it came to rest.
We're free to move on to Rule 12.
All right, Rule 12. This rule deals solely with bunkers. So let's start by taking a look at the definition of bunker on the bottom of page 329, which states that a bunker is a specially prepared area of sand, which is often a hollow from which turf has been removed and replaced with sand. And then it talks about areas that are not part of the bunker. Now, a lip, wall, or face around the edge of the prepared area and consisting of soil, grass, stacked turf, or artificial materials, but, and this is important, not sand. So it could be a stacked turf face, it could just be a bare earthen lip. That would not be part of the bunker. And a couple of significances for that, such as if the player's ball is embedded in that face, that means the ball is not embedded in the bunker, and the player is therefore allowed to take relief in the general area. Now, likewise, it means that if that's not part of the bunker, that if a player, say with his backswing, were to strike a bare earthen lip, he has not hit the sand in the bunker and is not in breach of Rule 12. Soil, meaning not sand, and any growing or attached natural object that's inside the edge of the prepared area, whether it's bushes or sometimes you see a tree, they are not inside the bunker. So, that would be important where, let's say, a player's ball came to rest in the branches of a tree that's rooted in the middle of a bunker. When the player takes unplayable lie relief for the ball on the tree, he is not restricted with the bunker options for that. Sand that's spilled over the edge of the bunker is not in the bunker. And all other areas of sand on the course that are not inside the edge of a prepared area are not part of the bunker. So naturally sandy areas such as at Sand Valley, those areas are not considered to be bunkers. Bunkers are one of the 5 defined areas of the course. Now, this ought to sound familiar. A player may define a prepared area of sand as part of the general area, which means it's not a bunker, or it may define a non-prepared area of sand as a bunker. Now, I'm trying to remember, because I was down with pneumonia during the state amateur last year, but at Sand Valley, I believe we said that all sandy areas are part of the general area and are not bunkers. So that would be an example of a committee doing that, especially in the case of Sand Valley, where it was hard to tell which is which is a bunker and which is a naturally sandy area. Now, when a bunker is being repaired and the committee defines the entire bunker as ground under repair, then that bunker automatically is part of the general area. So, for example, let's say a course is installing a new drainage in a bunker, and the bunker is completely under repair, and the committee has painted a white line all around the entire bunker, that by definition, that bunker is part of the general area, and the committee does not need to say it's part of the general area. So very committee and player friendly in that regard. The word sand is used and it includes any material similar to sand that's used as a bunker material. Could be, crushed shell, crushed, it could be lava dust or what have you. All right, so with that in mind, let's go back to Rule 12 and see what first the purpose of this rule is. And again, this, helps put things in perspective, that saying that bunkers are specially prepared areas that are intended to test the player's ability to play a ball from the sand. So they're saying, that's why bunkers are out there, because it's a different type of shot. Originally, it was supposed to be a little bit of a penalty for a wayward shot. Can argue today how much that still is true, but that is certainly the intent. And so in order to maintain that challenge of playing a ball from sand, there are going to be some restrictions as to what the player is allowed to do in a bunker before playing from there. First, let's look at this nice diagram, 12.1, that talks about or when the ball's in the bunker. There we see the ball embedded in the wall or face that's not covered with sand. That ball is not in the bunker. We see the ball in the sand, it's clearly in the bunker. We see a ball on a grass island, clearly not in the bunker. And then in the next section, we'll talk about that ball on the rake and whether that ball is in the bunker. And we know from the green check mark that it is in the bunker, but in case there's not a green check mark out on the course, let's see if we can determine for ourselves why that is considered to be in the bunker. So rule 12.1, a ball is in a bunker when any part of the ball touches sand on the ground inside the edge of the bunker, or the ball is inside the edge of the bunker and the ball also rests on ground where sand normally would be. For example, let's say there's been a torrential rain and now there's just a washout in the middle of the bunker where normally there's sand, there's just bare earth. Well, that ball would be considered, a ball line there would be considered in the bunker. Or if the ball is in or on a loose impediment, a movable obstruction, abnormal course condition, or integral object that touches sand in the bunker or is in ground where sand normally would be. So with the bunker rake here in this illustration, that ball is in the bunker because first, the ball is inside the outermost edge of the bunker. And secondly, the ball is on a movable obstruction, the bunker rake that is touching sand in the bunker. So if that ball were somehow positioned at the far right-hand handle of that bunker, somehow magically balanced there, that ball would not be considered in the bunker because the ball itself is not inside the edge of the bunker. If the ball lies on soil or grass or other growing or attached natural objects inside the edge of the bunker, but without touching the sand, the ball is not in the bunker, such as that ball in that little island of turf. Now, if part of the ball is both in a bunker and another area of the course, see Rule 2.2c, which gives us the pecking order as to where the ball would be. Is, for example, if it touched the bunker, but also touched the penalty area, or if it touched the general area and also touched the bunker. So now we've determined that the ball is in the bunker. So let's see what the player may and may not do when playing the ball from the bunker. First, Rule 12.2a, with about loose impediments and movable obstructions. Before playing from a bunker, the player may remove loose impediments, such as leaves, and movable obstructions. This includes any reasonable touching or movement of the sand in the bunker that happens while doing so. So if a player is removing, let's say, a bunker rake from a bunker, and when he goes down to lift the rake, he incidentally touches the sand with his fingertips, that's okay. That's okay. But this is one change for 2019, the ability to remove loose impediments from bunkers. So just something to keep in mind. Rule 12.2b, restrictions about touching the sand in a bunker. First, when there is a penalty. Before the stroke, the player must not deliberately touch sand in the bunker with a hand, club, or rake for the purpose of testing the condition of the sand to learn information for the next stroke. So for there to be a penalty, there have to be several requirements. One, it has to be deliberate touching, so not accidental. Two, it has to be specifically with the hand, the club, a rake, or another object, such as a tee. And then three, it has to be done for the purpose of testing the condition of the sand. So if that happens, the player would be in breach of the rules. So for example, if the player takes a practice swing, touching the sand in the bunker for the purpose of, learning about the sand for the next stroke, this is what would prohibit such an act. Now, second prohibition, touching the sand in the bunker with a club. And this is both, this applies to both deliberate touching and accidental touching. Because notice touch is not qualified. So that means it's any touching, deliberate or accidental, with a club in the area right in front of or right behind the ball, except as Dan covered in Rule 7.1a, and fairly searching for the ball, or as we saw above, in removing loose impediments. The player is not allowed to touch the sand in making a practice swing. So even if the player's intent was not necessarily to test the consistency of the sand, but the player's just making a practice swing, he is prohibited from doing that by this provision. And also in making the backswing for a stroke. So when playing from a bunker, the player is not allowed to ground the club at address, but also the player needs to take care not to touch the sand with the backswing. Because remember, these prohibitions apply before a stroke. Remember, the stroke is the downward movement of the club, the forward swing. So the backswing is not yet part of the stroke. So there would be a breach for touching the sand during the backswing. Okay, now in section 2, let's look at when touching the sand does not result in a penalty. So it goes on to say this rule does not prohibit the player from touching sand in the bunker in other ways, including digging in with the feet when taking a stance, that's okay. Smoothing the bunker to care for the course, that can be okay, but you almost want to put an asterisk next to this and refer to the paragraph at the end of section 2 here, which we'll cover in a minute. Placing clubs, equipment, or other objects in the bunker is allowed. Same with measuring, marking, lifting, or replacing, or anything else under a rule. Now, leaning on a club, whether it's just to rest, to stay balanced or prevent a fall, that is okay. That is okay, as long as, and this is where we see that reference to clause 1 up above, where that can kick in, as long as the player is not doing that for the purpose, not leaning on the club for the purpose of testing the sand's condition. And it's also okay, believe it or not, if the player strikes the sand in frustration or anger. You see this most often. Player's ball's in a bunker, plays a bunker shot, leaves it in the bunker, then in frustration takes a swipe at the sand. That, believe it or not, would not be a penalty. But that's interesting, because if the player were to just take a regular practice swing, that would be a penalty. But, and this is an important one, the player does get a penalty if their actions of touching the sand improve the conditions affecting the stroke in breach of Rule 8.1a. So let's go over this using the example of raking the bunker, since that's the most common one. Let's say a player's ball is in a long bunker, and the player's ball is in the front of it toward the green. The player sees some footprints in the back of the bunker. So on his way up to his ball, he rakes those footprints that are 10 yards behind the ball in the bunker. That would not be a breach, because he was, one, smoothing the bunker to care for the course, And two, that smoothing did not improve any of the conditions affecting the stroke. Now, what would be the ruling if player's ball is in a greenside bunker and there are footprints in front of his ball in the sand? And he thinks, gosh, I'd hate for someone behind me to wind up in these footprints. And he rakes those footprints, and then he rakes those footprints. Would that be allowed? The answer is no, because he did improve, i.e. create a potential advantage by improving his line of play by raking those footprints, because that could well affect his what happens after his next stroke. So those are examples of when smoothing the sand would and would not be permitted. Now, in clause 3, no restrictions after ball is played out of the bunker. So now the ball is no longer in this bunker. After a ball in the bunker is played and it is outside the bunker, or the player is taken or intends to take relief outside the bunker, player may touch sand in the bunker without penalty and smooth sand in the bunker to care for the course without penalty. This is true even if, here's another one of those even ifs, for emphasis, the ball comes to rest outside the bunker and the player is required or allowed to take stroke and distance relief by dropping a ball in the bunker. So perhaps the best way to look at that is an example I think we've used before of, let's say, the 12th hole at Augusta. Player's ball is in the back bunker. Player hits the sand shot too firmly, ball rolls across the green and down into Rays Creek. And he decides that his best relief option under the penalty area rule is stroke and distance. So this means that he is allowed to rake that bunker before he drops another ball in that bunker under stroke and distance. So normally, we're not allowed to improve the relief area, but this specific provision allows the player to do so. Next bullet point, saying that it's okay for the player to take those actions if the ball comes to rest outside the bunker and the sand in the bunker is on the player's line of play for the next stroke. So take a case like the road hole bunker on 17 at St. Andrews. Player's ball is near the front face. Player thinks he cannot play toward the hole. He decides to play backwards out of the bunker. And he plays backward out of the bunker, and now the bunker's on his line of play to the hole. Is he allowed to rake the bunker? And the answer is yes, he is, because he has played out of the bunker. And as long as one of the reasons he's raking it is to care for the course, he is allowed to rake it, even though doing so also improves his line of play. But for completeness, the rule goes on to say, but if the ball played from the bunker comes back into the bunker, the player takes relief by dropping in the bunker, or the player decides not to take relief outside the bunker, then the restrictions under clause 1, as well as rule 8.1a, apply again. All right, rule 12.3. This rule just lets us know that when the ball's in a bunker, there are certain relief situations that can exist. In other words, that a player does not completely give up all rights and options just because his ball is in a bunker. That is, the player could have interference by an abnormal course condition, most common example being temporary water in a bunker, and the player is entitled to free relief, but as we'll see, his hands are going to be somewhat tied as to needing to stay inside the bunker. Interference by dangerous animal condition. Certainly you could have, let's say, a rattlesnake in a bunker, and the player is going to be allowed relief from that. And you could have an unplayable ball in a bunker. And again, the player's relief options are going to be a little more restricted than they are for a ball that lies in the general area. All right, so that is Rule 12 dealing with bunkers. Any questions on that? Okay, if not, we'll continue on to Rule 13. And we'll start this rule with a handful of definitions, starting with flagstick itself. This rule covers putting greens, and putting green is where we find a flagstick. So let's see what a flagstick is. It's a movable pole provided by the committee for one purpose, and that's just to let players see where the hole is. And the term flagstick includes the flag itself and any other materials or objects. Could be a reflector for a laser, or a ball to indicate the hole location. Those are considered part of the flagstick. And when something else, whether artificial or natural, whether it's a club or a stick, is being used to show the position of the hole, that object is treated as if it is the flagstick for the purpose of applying the rules. You know, the common example of that is, let's say Thomas and I are playing together, and I'm 40 feet from the hole. I ask Thomas to remove the flagstick. He does. He sets it down. And then, of course, I realize my eyes aren't that good and I can't see the hole anymore. And I say, Thomas, would you mind just sticking your putter in the hole to show me where the hole is real quick? And he does so. That for that stroke, Thomas's putter is considered to have the same status as the flagstick. And then the requirements for a flagstick are in the equipment rules. Next definition, hole, on page, bottom of page 336. Hole is the finishing point on the putting green. It must be 4¼ inches in diameter, no more, no less, and it has to be at least 4 inches deep. And if a lining is used, the outer diameter must not exceed 4¼ inches, and the lining must be sunk at least 1 inch unless the nature of the soil requires it to be closer. So if the soil is so fragile and it's not stable enough that the liner needs to be closer to the surface, then that would be okay. Now, when the word hole, when not used in italics, is used through the rules, it means, for example, the fifth hole. It means the part of the course associated with a particular teeing area, putting green, and hole. Next definition right under it is hold. And that occurs when a ball is at rest in the hole after a stroke and the entire ball is below the surface of the putting green. When the rules refer to holing out or hole out, it means that the player's ball is holed. Now, there is a special case for a ball resting against the flagstick in the hole, and Rule 13.2c will tell us what the answer is. And there we're actually going to see that the ball can be considered holed, even though not all of it might be below the surface of the green. All right, speaking of green, let's look at putting green, which is on page 356. The putting green is the area on the hole the player is playing. So for a player, there is only one putting green at a time. We'll also talk about wrong putting greens later and restrictions with those. But it's the area of the hole being played that's specially prepared for putting, such as with by maintenance practices such as mowing height, etc., or if the committee has defined as the putting green, such as when a temporary putting green is used, and the committee might say on hole 13, the white line defines the putting green. Now, the putting green contains the hole into which the player tries to play a ball. Putting green is one of the 5 defined areas of the course. The edge of a putting green is defined by where it can be seen that the specially prepared area starts, such as the grass has been distinctly cut to show the edge. And thus, the committee defines the edge in a different way. Sometimes you'll see courses where the mowing height for the putting green and the fringe is so similar that it can be challenging to visually to tell what's the putting green and what is the general area. And sometimes in situations like that, the committee might put some white dots or blue dots or something else to indicate where the edge of the putting green is. Now, if a double green is used for two different holes, so think about at Black Wolf Run, the 18th greens for Meadow Valleys and the River Course that are joined there. The entire prepared area for both holes is treated as the putting green when playing each hole. But if for some reason the committee does not like the results that produces, for example, if the committee is concerned that leads to players trying to hit sand wedges off the putting green to hit the ball over a bunker to get back toward their hole, the committee may define an edge that divides the double green into two different putting greens. So a committee may do that, but is not required to. Wrong green on page 364. A wrong green is any green on the course other than the putting green for the hole the player's playing. And wrong greens include the putting greens for all other holes, the normal putting green for a hole where there's a temporary green, and all practice greens. Wrong greens are part of the general area. All right, now for the rule itself. Purpose. Rule 13's a specific rule for putting greens, which are specially prepared areas for playing the ball along the ground. And that's an important distinction, that on putting greens, the intent is for players to play the ball along the ground. So that's why they're so carefully and painstakingly maintained, and why some of these rules we'll see are going to be different, usually in a more generous way than they are for other parts of the course. Rule 13.1, actions allowed or required on putting greens. This rule allows the player to do things on the putting green that are normally not allowed off the putting green, such as lifting, cleaning, and replacing a ball, and repairing damage, as well as removing sand and loose soil. There's no penalty for accidentally causing a ball or ball marker to move on the putting green. So let's first talk about when a ball is considered to be on the putting green. And that can be an important point. And, as a referee, that can be, a fairly common question that players will call you over when their ball is very close to the edge of the putting green, because the players want that ball to be on the green primarily so that they can lift, clean, and replace that ball. So in some cases, especially if there's mud on the ball, that can be a big difference, an important distinction. So a ball is on the putting green when any part of the ball touches the putting green or lies on or in anything such as a loose impediment or obstruction and is inside the edge of the putting green. So similar to what we just saw with bunkers. So if the ball is inside the edge of the putting green, but let's say it lies on a leaf that's on the putting green. Well, even though that ball doesn't actually touch the surface of the putting green, that ball is considered to be on the putting green. Rule 13.1b, ball on the putting green may be lifted and cleaned. The spot must be marked before it's lifted, and the ball must be replaced on its original spot. So those are the basics for the putting green. You have to mark the spot, and you have to replace the ball on that spot before playing. But the player is allowed to lift the ball and is allowed to, you see some players, very carefully line up the logo or any marks on their ball when putting, and that is okay. Rule 13.1c, improvements that are allowed on the putting green. Player may take these two actions no matter whether the ball is on or off the putting green. And that's a common question that not all players understand. All these permissions apply even to a ball off the putting green. So if a player's ball is on the fringe, the player may take these actions on the putting green itself, not on the intervening part of the fringe between the player's ball and the putting green, but on the putting green itself, the player may take these actions, such as removing sand and loose soil, something a player is not allowed to do elsewhere on the course if that would, for example, improve the conditions affecting the stroke, but is allowed on the putting green. Repair of damage. Players allowed to repair damage on the putting green by taking reasonable actions to restore, emphasis on restore, the putting green as nearly as possible to its original condition. So the player, in other words, isn't allowed to try to make things better than it ever was, but is allowed to restore the condition to what it was, but only by using their hand, foot, or other body part, or a normal ball mark repair tool, tee, club, or similar item of normal equipment. So that's how the player may repair the damage and without unreasonably delaying play. But if the player improves the putting green by taking actions that exceed what is reasonable to restore the putting green, that player will get the general penalty. Now, what does damage on the putting green mean? Well, this includes any damage caused by any person, even the player himself, or outside influence. Could be ball marks, shoe damage, including even spike marks, scrapes or indentations, old hole plugs, turf plugs, sod seams, and scrapes and indentations from maintenance tools or vehicles. Animal tracks. So this is helpful. So that means if a player let's say a player in the first group out comes to the fourth putting green and there are deer tracks on it, this allows the player on his own, without the committee's approval, to go ahead and repair the deer tracks that are on the putting green, as well as embedded objects and the indentations caused by them. But damage on the putting green does not include damage that results from normal maintenance practices, such as aeration holes and verticutting grooves. Damage caused by irrigation or rain or other natural forces. And so that would, and then natural surface imperfections, such as weeds or just bare turf, or natural wear of the hole. So those items may not be repaired, if doing so would improve the conditions affecting the stroke. Next section, 13.1D. What happens when the ball or ball marker moves on the putting green? And we touched on this last week under Rule 9, and we're going to see that this is a big exception to some parts of Rule 9. And that is if there's no penalty for accidental movement on the putting green. So as long as the ball is on the putting green, ball or ball marker is on the putting green, and the movement was accidental, there is not going to be a penalty, but the player is still going to be required to replace the ball or place a ball marker to mark that original spot. Exception to that is the ball must be played as it lies when the ball begins to move during the backswing or stroke, and the stroke is made. So in those cases, the player is not going to be required to replace the ball, and there will be no penalty if the cause for the ball's movement was accidental on the putting green. Now, if the player or opponent deliberately lifts the player's ball or ball marker, then we're going to go back to Rule 9.4 to see if there is a penalty. Because if you deliberately lift your ball or another ball In some cases, there can be a penalty. In some cases, there would not be. So we just had to go to rule 9.4, 9.5, and based on exactly what happened, and that will tell us if there's a penalty. Now, what to do if a ball on the putting green is moved by natural forces? And we talked about this last week under Rule 9.3, and there are two variations of that. If natural forces cause a player's ball on the putting green to move, well, first, we know there's not going to be a penalty. So it's a question of where will the player make the next stroke from. Where the player will play from depends on whether the ball had already been lifted and replaced. Now, if the ball had been lifted and replaced, then the ball must be replaced on the spot it moved from, even though it was moved by natural forces. So player's balls on the putting green, marks the spot, lifts the ball, replaces it, and then the wind, and there's absolutely no doubt that the wind caused the ball to move. The wind moves the ball 6 inches. The player in that case is going to be required to replace the ball to its original spot 6 inches back, so where it was before the wind moved it. However, if the player had not lifted and replaced the ball, then the player will play the ball from new spot. The example we used was, I hit my approach shot to a putting green. As I'm walking, the ball comes to rest on the putting green. As I'm walking toward the green, the wind blows really hard and moves the ball 5 feet. Then in that case, I'm going to play the ball from where the wind blew it. So from its new position, 5 feet away from where it originally finished. No penalty. Rule 13.1E. We talked about in Rule 12 how a player is not allowed to test the condition of the bunker. Now we're going to talk about testing putting greens, and it's going to be very specific as to what acts a player is prohibited from taking. During a round and while play is stopped, player must not deliberately take either of these actions for the purpose of testing the putting green or a wrong green. So if you're playing hole number 5, you can't go over to hole number 7 and do this either. And that is rub the surface or roll a ball. The exception, though, is that between 2 holes, a player may rub the surface or roll a ball on the green of the hole just completed or any practice green. And why is that allowed? Well, because we saw last week that the player is allowed to practice putting on those greens. So it makes sense that if he's allowed to practice putting, also let him rub the surface or roll a ball. Rule 13.1F. Relief must be taken from a wrong green. We've alluded to this a little bit. And there's one and only one reason for this rule, and that's just to protect the condition of putting greens, because a lot of time and expense go into maintaining putting greens. And obviously courses don't want to see players gouge large divots out of them. When does a player have interference by a wrong green? A player has interference when any part of the ball touches a wrong green or lies on or in anything such as a loose impediment and is inside the edge of the wrong green. So if the ball itself's on the wrong green, the player has interference, or if the wrong green physically interferes with the area of intended stance or area of intended swing. So for example, if the ball is just off the wrong green, but the player's club would strike the wrong green on the follow through, the player has interference. And that means, as the title of the second clause tells us, relief must be taken. When there is interference by a wrong green, player must not play the ball as it lies. So the player is required to take free relief, and he will do so by dropping the original ball or another ball. The reference point is going to be the nearest point of complete relief. It's in the same area of the course. So In most cases, that'll be the general area. The player will get a club length from there, but where the player will drop the ball must be in the same area of the course as the reference point. So usually the general area must not be nearer the hole than the reference point, and the player must take complete relief from the wrong putting green. So complete relief from the wrong putting green means the ball is not on it. It does not interfere with the stance or an area of intended swing. There is an exception, and that is that there's no relief under this rule if interference exists only because the player chooses a club, type of stance, swing, or direction of play that is clearly unreasonable under the circumstances. So that exception is in there to prevent abuse. For example, imagine the player is in the ball lies in some very thick rough near a wrong putting green, and the player says, oh, you know what, if I say I'm going to play this ball left-handed, the stance for my left-handed stroke would be on the putting green on this wrong green, so therefore I'm going to get free relief and I might be able to get out of this thick rough. In that case, there would not be relief. And Dan will go into this more in Rule 16, but a good way to look at it is to say, okay, if that wrong green were not there, how would the player play the ball? And if the answer is, well, he would not play it left-handed, then he would not be entitled to free relief if the left-hand stroke is the only type of stroke that would give him interference. And we see with diagram 13.1F a nice description. So here at point A, the player has all types of interference. For the lie of the ball, area of intended stance, area of intended swing, he'll determine his nearest point of relief at P1, which gives him relief from all three: lie, area of intended stance, and swing. And then he'll get a club length from there, not closer to the hole, keeping the ball in the general area, since that's where the reference point is. All right, next section, dealing with the flag stick. This rule covers the player's choices for dealing with the flag stick. And remember, the flag stick's there for one purpose, just to let players see from a distance where the hole is. There is normally no penalty if a ball in motion hits the flag stick. So we know that there are going to be exceptions to that, because normally is not an absolute term. This rule applies to a ball played from anywhere on the course, whether on or off the putting green. A common misconception is, for example, you could have the flag stick intended only for a stroke from the putting green. Not true. If you want to have the flag stick intended for, let's say, a chip shot from off the green, that's okay. Rule 13.2a talks about leaving the flag stick in the hole. So, and this was, one of the more visible changes for 2019, so that now a player may always leave the flag stick in the hole unattended, with there being no penalty for striking it, even from the putting green. Players allowed to leave the flag stick in the hole. Player has to decide to do this before making the stroke, either by leaving where it is or having a removed flag stick put back in the hole. The player is not allowed to gain an advantage by deliberately moving the flag stick to a position other than centered. So if the player, for example, can't put the flag stick in the hole and have the flag stick lean back away from him, that is not permissible. But if the player arrives at a green and the previous group had been a little sloppy replacing the flag stick, and the flag stick happened to be in such a position, is that okay? That would be okay, because here this talks about just deliberately moving the flag stick to a position. Second clause, no penalty if the ball hits the flag stick left in the hole. No penalty, and the ball must be played as it lies. So whether that was played from on or off the putting green. 3, a limitation on the player moving or removing the flag stick while the ball is in motion. So if the flag stick had been left in the hole when the stroke is made, the player or their caddy must not deliberately move or remove the flag stick to affect where the ball in motion might come to rest. If this is done, the player gets the general penalty. So that's an intent-based penalty. If they move the flag stick for that purpose, regardless of whether the ball strikes the flag stick, the player gets the general penalty. But there is no penalty if the player has the flag stick in the hole removed for any other reason, such as because a ball may have already gone past the hole and what is not, because the undulations is not going to return to the hole. Clause 4, a limitation on other players moving or removing the flag stick from the hole. So if the player left the flag stick in the hole and did not authorize anyone to attend it, then another player must not deliberately move or remove the flag stick for the purpose of affecting where the ball in motion might come to rest. Now, if another player or their caddy does so before or during the stroke, and the player makes the stroke without knowing this, or does so while the player's ball is in motion, that other player gets the general penalty. So if the other player does so, for the purpose of affecting what happens to the player's ball, could be for good reasons or for bad reasons, that other player will get the general penalty. But there's no penalty if that other player or their caddy removes the flag stick for another reason, such as when they reasonably believe the ball will not hit the flag stick, or are not aware that the player is about to play or that the ball's in motion. So in other words, let's say Jeff and I are playing together. I leave the flag stick in the hole, I putt, and let's say my putt goes past the hole, and then Jeff's caddy goes ahead and removes the flag stick because Jeff does not want the flag stick in the hole for his putt. That is okay, because at that point, it's reasonable to conclude that my ball would not make a sudden U-turn because it's a flat green and return to the hole and strike the flag stick. All right, rule 13.2b, removing the flag stick from the hole. Player may make a stroke with the flag stick removed from the hole. See this, most often with putting, and especially the shorter putts. Player must decide this before making the stroke by either having the flag stick removed or authorizing someone to attend the flag stick. Now, what does that mean, to attend the flag stick? It means to hold the flag stick in, above, or next to the hole before the stroke to show the player where the hole is, and then remove the flag stick during the stroke or after the stroke. And the player is treated as having authorized this attendance if the player's own caddy is holding the flag stick there or standing right next to the hole when the stroke is made, even if the player is not aware the caddy is doing so, or if the player asks someone else to attend the flag stick and that person does so, or the player sees another person holding the flag stick there or standing right next to the hole and the player makes the stroke without objecting. Now, what to do if the ball hits the flag stick or the person attending it? Well, as we're going to see, similar to Rule 11, we'll have to see whether that deflection is accidental or deliberate. First bullet, ball accidentally hits flag stick or person who removed it or is attending it. If the ball in motion accidentally hits the flag stick or the person who removed or is attending it, there's no penalty and the ball must be played as it lies. For example, let's say Drew asked me to attend the flag stick for him, and while I'm doing so, I get distracted watching players on another hole. I'm not aware that Drew putts and his ball strikes me or the flag stick. that there would be no penalty. That was accidental deflection. Now, if the ball is deliberately deflected or stopped by a person attending the flagstick, then Rule 11.2C applies. So where's the ball played from? Player must not play the ball as it lies and instead must take relief under Rule 11.2C. And then when the penalty applies, if the person who deliberately deflected or stopped the ball was a player, that player will get the general penalty. So for the purpose of this rule, deliberately deflected or stopped means the same thing in Rule 11.2A. It includes when the player's ball in motion hits a removed flagstick that was deliberately positioned or left in a particular place so that it might deflect or stop the ball, an intended flagstick that the person deliberately failed to remove or remove from the hole, or the person who intended to remove the flagstick when they deliberately failed to move out of the way of the ball. So for example, I'm attending the flagstick for Drew putts, and I think, gosh, his ball might hit my foot. I'm going to leave my foot here so it will hit it. Then that would be a deliberate deflection by me. All right, Rule 13.2C, ball resting against flagstick in the hole. And this is a very specific situation. So a very narrow set of facts would apply here. If a ball comes to rest against the flagstick that's left in the hole, and if any part of the ball is in the hole below the surface of the putting green, the ball is treated as holed. And here we see this again, even if the entire ball is not below the surface. So part of the ball is in the hole below the surface, and the ball is against the flagstick. The flagstick's in the hole. That ball is considered holed. The player does not have to jiggle the flagstick to get the ball to fall to the bottom. However, in the very unlikely situation that no part of the ball is in the hole below the surface of the putting green, then that ball is not holed and must be played as it lies. And if the flagstick is removed and the ball moves, whether it falls into the hole or moves away from the hole, there's no penalty and the ball must be replaced on the lip. And then after the penalty statement for playing from the wrong place, there's a reminder that in stroke play, a player is going to be disqualified if they fail to hole out. So in that second case where that ball is not holed, if the player mistakenly believes it's holed, just picks the ball up, goes to the next hole, tees off, that player in stroke play would be disqualified for not having holed out at the previous hole. All right, Rule 13.3, another very specific set of circumstances, and that is when the ball overhangs the hole. First, we'll see how long a player is allowed to see if the ball will fall into the hole. Now, if any part of the ball overhangs the lip of the hole, so that's the first point. This rule applies only when it overhangs the lip of the hole. If the ball is 1 inch away from the hole, this rule does not apply. But if part overhangs the lip of the hole, the player is allowed a reasonable time to reach the hole and 10 more seconds to see whether the ball will fall into the hole. Now, if the ball falls into the hole in this waiting time, the player has holed out with the previous stroke. So good news. But if the ball does not fall into the hole within this waiting time, the ball is treated as being at rest. And if the ball falls into the hole before it's played, the player has holed out with the previous stroke, but the player is going to get 1 penalty stroke added to the score for the hole. All right, now let's go back and look at a couple of important points of this rule. First, the first bullet point, players allowed a reasonable time to reach the hole and then 10 more seconds. Well, that is going to vary from shot to shot. So, for example, if a player is playing a 150-yard approach shot and his ball comes to rest overhanging the lip of the hole, it may well take him a few minutes to get to the hole. And then when he gets there, he's allowed 10 more seconds to see if the ball will fall into the hole. Now, that's very different from the case where a player has a 5-foot putt and he putts, the ball comes to rest overhanging the lip of the hole. In that case, it's only going to take him a second or two to walk to the hole, and then he'll have 10 more seconds. So in other words, in those two examples, the total elapsed time from when the ball came to rest overhanging the hole to the end of that 10-second waiting period is going to vary, just based on where the players were. So if the ball falls into the hole within that waiting time, the players hold out with his previous stroke. So let's take the example of par 3 hole. Player hits the green and from 20 feet away putts. Ball comes to rest overhanging the lip of the hole. The player then walks to the hole, taking a reasonable amount of time. And then after 6 more seconds, the ball falls into the hole. The player's score for the hole then is 2. And so he's happy. Now, let's say another player, par 3 hole, hits his tee shot onto the green, also 20 feet from the hole. He putts, ball comes to rest overhanging the lip of the hole. The player takes a reasonable amount of time to walk to the hole. And then after waiting 12 more seconds, the ball falls into the hole. Well, in that case, the player has finished the hole, but his score for the hole is 3, because he's going to get a penalty stroke for the ball falling in after the waiting time. Now, third and final example. Player hits his ball onto the green of a par 3, 20 feet from the hole, putts, ball comes to rest overhanging the lip of the hole. Player quickly walks to the hole, and after 12 seconds, the ball is not fallen in, and the player goes ahead and taps in. Then his score for the hole is 3. So that is why the player in the second example gets that penalty stroke for the ball falling in after the waiting time. Because what that means is after the waiting time, the reasonable time to get to the hole plus the 10 seconds, the player has no incentive to wait any longer, because whether the ball falls in on its own or the player taps in, it's still going to be 1 more stroke. Just a question of whether it's a penalty stroke or an actual stroke made with the club. Notice if the ball does not fall into the hole within that waiting time, the ball is treated as being at rest. And that's an important provision because that protects the player. It protects the player from being penalized for potentially playing a moving ball. So that means if the player's ball comes to rest overhanging the hole, and after the waiting time, the ball has not fallen in, and the player goes ahead to tap the ball, and the ball starts to move, and the player makes a stroke at the ball while it's moving, then he's not considered to have played a moving ball and therefore does not get that penalty. So that part is there to protect the player. All right, 13.3b. What to do if ball overhanging the hole is lifted or moved before the waiting time has ended. Again, a very helpful and descriptive rule title there. So if the ball is overhanging the hole and it's lifted or moved other than by natural forces, but certainly if wind blows the ball into the hole, then that's the player's good luck and the ball is holed. But if it's lifted or moved before the waiting time has ended, the ball is treated as having come to rest, and the ball must be replaced on the lip, and the waiting time no longer applies. So in other words, if for some reason player's ball comes to rest overhanging the lip, the player lifts the ball, marks, lifts, and replaces it, that's fine. He's allowed to do that. But when he replaces it, the provisions of this rule no longer apply. So if the ball then falls in, he is not going to be able to say, oh, great, I got a hole in one, or whatever the case might be. Now, what happens if another player is the one who lifted or moved the ball overhanging the hole before the waiting time expired? All right, well, and in this case, there's going to be a penalty for that player, because that player has deprived the owner of the ball from the right of seeing if the ball was going to fall in on its own within that waiting period. If this happens in match play, you have a very nice, sensible result that we can have in match play, and that is that the player's ball is treated as hold with the previous stroke, and there's no penalty. So the opponent has potentially just shot himself in the foot by doing that. And the player's ball is considered hold, but no penalty. Now, if this happens in stroke play, though, because of the size of the field, we can't have a result like that. So the other player who lifted or moved the ball from the lip is going to get the general penalty, and the owner of the ball is going to replace the ball on the lip of the hole. So again, that hopefully those penalties are partially intended to deter other players from touching or moving a player's ball in such a situation. All right, so that is rule 13, another specific rule for a specific part of the course. Any questions on that?
Yeah, John, just have a question for you, going back to repair of damage.
Okay.
In parentheses, it says, when it's talking about restoring conditions and whatnot, it says such as, what's not allowed is such as creating a pathway to the hole. Do you have like a good example for that? I think we've all had a situation where it's like, you know, stuff that falls off pine trees onto a green, and there's so many of them, and you kind of just get lazy, and you kind of, you know, it's like, oh, this is going to be my line, so I just clear it out of that. You know, like, is that allowed or no?
Yeah. The caution against creating a pathway does not apply to loose impediments. That would apply more to a case where a player is, it's almost hard to imagine where a player is really just pressing down his putter hard to try to create like a channel within the surface of the putting green itself, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question.
We have two questions from online. First question being, after play of a hole is completed, may a player try to repair the edge of a hole that has become ragged during the course of the day's play?
Oh, yes. In a situation like that, that is permissible. You know, if players group is finished and the player says, gosh, this isn't doing well, we still have 6 groups behind. Let me see if I can repair this as a courtesy to the other groups. That is permissible.
And last one from online, what happens if the mark, I'm guessing ball marker, sticks to the player's putter after he pushes that mark down?
Okay. Oh, what happens if the player marks the spot of the ball and then presses it down and sticks to it? In that case, there's not going to be a penalty, and the player will either put the ball back down or the ball marker back down.
And one last one that just came in, I think we hit on it, but just a little clarification. If the ball hits the liner of the cup, not deliberately, there's no penalty and the ball is played as it lies, correct?
Correct. I mean, every now and then you'll see on TV some strange situation where, say, a short putt hits like the back edge of the hole liner or something and pops out. And there's certainly no penalty for striking the hole liner, and but the bad news is that the ball is not holed if it didn't wind up in the hole, and so the player would just play the ball from wherever it came to rest.
Okay, with that, there are no more questions from online or here in the room. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break before we turn things over to Mr. Stolper. He's going to start covering rule number 14, and we might even get into 15, he says. So he's feeling a little motivated. So we'll go ahead and take a break right now. John, thank you, and yeah, we'll continue in 15 minutes.
Can I ask one more quick one?
No.
All right, we are back and gonna have Dan start here with Rule 14.
All right, this is Rule 14, procedures for the ball. This is the how of the rules. Everything else we're talking about is what you do, when you do it. When you want to know how you do something, how do you replace a ball? How do you lift the ball? How do you drop a ball? How do you do this? How do you do that? You look at Rule 14. If you want to be a rules official, you got to know the how on how you do stuff. And so you have to know Rule 14. Procedure for the ball: marking, lifting, cleaning, replacing on spot, dropping in relief area, playing from wrong place. Let's look at the purpose of this rule, and then we'll look at a few definitions. Rule 14 covers when and how the player may mark the spot of a ball at rest and lift and clean the ball, and how to put the ball back into play so that the ball is played from the right place. In other words, it's the how that we're concerned with. When a lifted or moved ball is to be replaced, the same ball must be set down on its original spot. Notice the word replace there. When taking free relief or penalty relief, a substituted ball or an original ball must be dropped in the particular relief area. A mistake in using these procedures may be corrected without penalty before the ball is played, but the player gets the penalty if they play the ball from the wrong place. And this is Rule 14.5, that last part that we're going to talk about. So let's look at 14.1, marking, lifting, and cleaning ball. Let's start with a couple of definitions pertinent to Rule 14.1. The first one is a ball marker on 328. Uh, 328, ball marker, an artificial object when used to mark the spot of the ball to be lifted. Put a period there. That's the definition of a ball marker. And before we go further, this is one of the techniques in the rules that you will see over and over again. There'll be a definition, there'll be a rule that says this is what it is, and then it'll say comma, such as. Notice the such as are examples of what was preceding it, but it's not an exclusive list. In some rules, you will see da, 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 and it is the following three items. When you see a rule like that, it means those three items and only those three items. So going back to the definition of ball marker, it says an artificial object when used to mark the spot of the ball. The such as are examples: a tee, a coin, an object made to be a ball marker, or another piece of equipment, or another small piece of equipment. Definition of mark on page 344. To show the spot where a ball is at rest by either placing a ball marker right behind or right next to the ball, or holding a club on the ground right behind or right next to the ball. This is done to show the spot where the ball must be replaced after it is lifted. Sometimes the question you get is, can you mark your ball by putting the ball marker in front? Yes, you can. Move it to the side. The key is you have to put it next to it such that you can get the ball back in the same spot. So let's look at 14.1. This rule applies to the deliberate lifting of a player's ball at rest. This may be done in any way, which includes picking up the ball by hand, rotating it, or otherwise deliberately causing it to move. 14.1a. Spot a ball to be lifted and replaced must be marked. Before lifting a ball under a rule requiring the ball to be replaced on its original spot, the player must mark the spot. Let's stop there. You're only required to mark the spot of the ball if you're going to return the ball to that spot. So if you are going to take relief because your ball's on a cart path, you don't have to mark the spot of the ball. It's only if you're going to replace the ball, which means to place a ball marker right behind or right next to, or hold a club on the ground. And again, that's the definition of a ball marker. If the spot is marked with a ball marker after replacing the ball, the player must remove the ball marker before making a stroke. This was a change in 2019. The theory was you don't want to allow someone to leave the ball marker there because it could be considered an alignment device. So that's why you're required to pick up your ball marker before you make the stroke. If you don't, it's a one-stroke penalty. When a ball is lifted to take relief under a rule, the player is not required to mark the spot before lifting it. Again, we just went over that. If you're replacing it, you have to mark it, otherwise you don't. All right, so let's talk about who, 14.1b. Who may lift the ball? The player's ball may be lifted under the rules only by the player or anyone the player authorizes, but such authorization must be given each time before the ball is lifted rather than given generally for the round. Again, when it talks about the player, rules 1 through 20 are written for individual play. So if it refers to the player, notice the blue language at the bottom of this section. It's the very bottom of the section. In foursomes and foursomes and four ball, where you have a partner, that other partner can do it as well. Exception: when caddy may lift player's ball without authorization. The caddy may lift the player's ball without authorization when the player's ball is on the putting green. That's an absolute. The caddy can always do that, even if for whatever reason. Or if it is reasonable to conclude, such as from an action or statement, that the player will take relief under a rule. So an example of that is the ball is on a cart path. The player gets his driver out. He measures the one club length, doesn't say anything to the caddy, and then the caddy picks up the ball. Is it reasonable to conclude that the player will be taking relief in that situation? The answer is yes. If the caddy lifts the ball when not allowed, then there would be a one-stroke penalty. All right, cleaning the ball. A ball lifted from the putting green may always be cleaned. See, John just went over that. A ball lifted from anywhere else may always be cleaned, except in 4 exceptions. Before we go over those 4 exceptions, understand that the word cleaned means that, and it sounds crazy, but the ball has to be dirty first. You cannot clean a clean ball. We had an example of this at the state amateur at Sand Valley. It was the third hole on the Mammoth Dunes course. The player's ball was very near the putting green. He was asked to pick it up, and because it interfered with play, he picked it up and he put it in his pocket. Someone complained that he was cleaning the ball, and the rule, so we had a discussion among the rules official, and the rules official on the spot, I think it was Chuck Heath, talked to the players and they all agreed that there was nothing on the ball. Well, if there's nothing on the ball, it can't be cleaned. We have interesting clarification on that. It is 14.1 C1 on page 196. It talks about not putting a ball into your pocket because it could be considered cleaning. But the last paragraph says, however, if the player takes these actions, such as placing a ball in his pocket, after lifting a ball that was known to be clean before it was lifted, the player does not get a penalty because the ball was not clean. So if you got a clean ball, you can't get a penalty for cleaning it. All right. A lifted ball from anywhere else on the course other than the putting green may always be cleaned except in these 4 specific instances. You can memorize those 4 and then remember anything else you can. The other way is to, when I think about these, I think of these as 4 instances in which the player is in control of whether the ball can be cleaned, and thus the rules don't want you to circumvent the rules of no cleaning. So an example, you see if you pick your ball up to see if it's cut or cracked. You pick your ball up to identify it. You pick your ball up to see if it lies in the condition. The rules are saying you can't clean it in that situation because otherwise the player would always say, well, I'm going to identify this. He picks it up, he cleans it and puts it back. The 4th one on the list is because it interferes with play. The reason that that's on the list is because the old rule referred to interfering or assisting play, and so it would fall into that same list. 2019, the word assist was taken out of that, and now there's only interference with play. But that's how I remember these 4, is if you're in charge of something, we don't want you to circumvent the rule of no cleaning. Final point on that, you can always clean the ball when you're lifting it up to put it back into a place, as long as it isn't one of these 4. So an example, and we get this question fairly often, a person's ball comes up against a rake by a bunker, the player moves the rake, the ball moves, the player picks up the ball, it's got mud on it. Can he clean it? And the answer is yes. Why? Because it's not one of these 4 items. And this is an exhaustive list. If it's not one of these 4, you get to clean it. All right, 14.2. And let's look at one definition on that, and it's replace on 358. Replace, to place a ball by setting it down by hand and letting it go with the intent for it to be in play. The change for this year, it's not a change, it's just a little bit extra wording. It uses the word setting it down by hand. The old rules, you had to look to a clarification or an interpretation. Now it's in the definition itself. That's what replace means. If a player sets a ball down without intending for it to be in play, the ball has not been replaced and is not in play. We're going to go over this when we see 14.4. We touched on this last time under the definition of wrong ball and wrong place. All right, 14.2, replacing ball on spot. The rule applies whenever a ball is lifted or moved and a rule requires it to be replaced on a spot. The original ball must be used. And again, the way to remember this is you are putting the ball back on the spot. When you do that, you can't substitute. We went under that, we discussed this under Rule 6.3b1. The original ball, and then the 4 exceptions, and there's always a common sense exceptions. You don't have to use the original ball if the original ball cannot be recovered within a reasonable effort and in a few seconds, so long as the player did not deliberately cause the ball to move. There was an example on, I think it was a PGA Tour, where a player bent over to mark their ball and they swiped it away carelessly and the ball went into the penalty area into water. No penalty. Is he allowed to substitute? Yes, because he did not deliberately cause his ball to move. The other ones, the ball is cut or cracked. Play resumes after it has been stopped, and the original ball was played by another player as a wrong ball. In those 4 exceptions, you can substitute ball. 14.2b, who must replace ball and how it must be replaced. The player's ball must be replaced under the rules only by the player and any person who lifted the ball or caused it to move. So if a spectator moves the ball, the spectator can put it back. Note, however, that the player is going to be responsible if it's in the wrong place. So it is a good idea to have the spectator say, I think it was here, and then have the player replace the ball. If a player plays a ball that was replaced by someone not allowed to do so, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. A bizarre situation happened. A player hits his ball in the middle of the fairway. It's a PGA Tour. I forget what the tour was. A little kid ran out, excited, saw a golf ball, brought it back. His father, sort of mortified, went back, placed the ball back in the center of the fairway. Well, the father wasn't the one who picked up the ball. It was the kid who picked up the ball. The kid can replace it, but the father can't replace it. How ball must be replaced. The ball must be replaced by setting it down by hand on the required spot and letting it go so it stays on the spot. And again, the key is it has to be done by hand. If the player plays a ball that was replaced in a wrong way, but on the required spot, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. We're going to see throughout this rule and many of the relief rules that if you use the wrong procedure, you're going to get 1 penalty stroke. If you play from the wrong place, you're going to get 2 penalty strokes. That's a general rule. There may be some exceptions. All right, 14.2c, spot where ball is replaced. The ball must be replaced on its original spot, which if not known, must be estimated, except when the ball must be replaced on a different spot under 14.2d and 14.2e, which we're going to go over in a minute. If the ball was at rest on, under, or against an immovable obstruction, integral object, boundary object, or growing or attached natural object, the spot of the ball includes its vertical location relative to the ground. This means that the ball must be replaced on its original spot under or against such an object. If any loose impediments were removed as a result of the ball being lifted or moved, or before the ball was replaced, they do not need to be replaced. There is an interesting clarification that talks about vertical location. Remember, the spot of the ball includes both the east, west, north, south, as well as the up and down. If you are required to replace a ball and there is a huge piece of mud on that, you cannot set the ball on the mud if the ball wasn't on the mud before you set it down. Why? Because you will be replacing it not in the correct spot. You will be placing it a quarter of an inch, a half an inch above the spot. I believe that's 14.2c1. All right, where to replace ball when original lie altered. This is 14.2d, a very important rule, referred to often as the lie altered rule. If a lie of a lifted or moved ball that must be replaced is altered, the player must replace the ball in this way. And notice that we have 2 exceptions and two separate ways to do this. You have ball in sand, and then 2 is ball anywhere except in sand. The ball in sand does not say the ball in bunker. It says the ball in sand. So when we played the Sand Valley course this summer for the State Am, there were no bunkers on the course. Everything was sand. And if we had one of these situations, it would be under number 1. When the ball was in sand, whether in a bunker or anywhere else on the course, in replacing a ball in its original spot, the player must recreate the original lie as much as possible. In recreating the lie, the player may leave a small part of the ball visible if the ball had been covered by sand. So what this means is if you hit your ball into a bunker or sand in the general area, and then the lie is altered. Why would the lie be altered? Well, maybe another player stepped on it, maybe a vehicle ran over it, maybe another player played after you had lifted the ball. In that case, you have to recreate it. It's incumbent upon you to know what your lie was before it was altered. And then you have to, if you have a completely fried egg lie, you have to push the ball into the sand to recreate that lie. If you had only a half fried egg, if there is such a thing, then you only put it halfway down. But you have to put the ball into the sand and recreate the lie. If the player plays from the right place, but fails to recreate the lie in the breach of this rule, the player gets the general penalty. This is new language for 2023. What it's saying is you have put the ball back where you're supposed to play it, but you didn't push it down into the sand, which is what you were obligated to do. What they're saying here is you get the general penalty for that. All right, second one here, number 2, ball anywhere except in sand. When the ball was anywhere except in sand, the player must replace the ball by placing it on the nearest spot with a lie most similar to the original lie. That is, and we have 3 bullet points, within 1 club length, not near the hole, in the same area of the course. Notice this rule does not say if the lie has been altered, you get to put it anywhere you want within 1 club length. The rule says you have to put it in the nearest spot. The 1 club length is the absolute outer limit for which you can put the ball. So an example, your ball is in the middle of the fairway. A maintenance vehicle runs over the ball, pushing it down. 14.2D2 says you have to place it in the nearest spot with a lie most similar. Generally speaking, if that's in the middle of the fairway, you would put it a few inches away outside of the indented mark. That would be the nearest spot within 1 club length, not near the hole, and in the same area of the course. Notice that if your ball was laying in a divot hole in the middle of the fairway and a maintenance vehicle runs over that, what are you obligated to do? You are required to put it in the lie, the nearest spot with a lie most similar. If within 1 club length there is no other divot hole, you have to most likely put it back in that divot hole if that is the lie most similar. There may be a situation where there is another lie, and you may determine that that lie is the one that's most similar because the original lie that was the divot hole has now been altered so much that it's no longer a similar lie. All right, if the player knows that the original lie altered but does not know where the lie was, the player must estimate the lie and replace the ball under 1 or 2. This is a nice change for 2019. The old rule was if the ball was altered in tall grass, somebody kicks it, you would then drop it. The rules now are clear that you need to replace the ball, which means you have to do your best to find out what the lie was and where it was. So if the ball was lying under some tall grass, you don't get to set it on top of the tall grass. You have to reach under and put it under the tall grass if that's the estimated spot where the ball was moved from. Notice exceptions for a lie altered while play is stopped and ball has been lifted. What this is saying is, says Rule 5.7D, basically, the way to think about that is the lie altered rule under 14.2D is turned off once there has been a suspension. The reason is for that is you could have a suspension that's an hour or 2 hours, or it could be overnight, and it may be impossible to recreate the lie and so forth. So what they're saying is when that happens, you're just going to proceed under 5.7D, which John covered last week or the week before. All right, 14.2E, what to do if replaced ball does not stay on original spot. If a player tries to replace a ball but it does not stay on the original spot, the player must try a second time. If the ball again does not stay on the spot, the player must replace the ball by placing it on the nearest spot where the ball will stay at rest, but with these limitations. The spot must not be near the hole. Original spot is in the general area. You must replace it in the general area. Original spot in the bunker must stay in the bunker or the penalty area. Original spot on the green, you have to stay on the green or the general area. So you could have a situation, this came up at Erin Hills on the 15th hole. Player's ball hit it just short. The 15th hole is a short par 4 with an elevated green. The player's ball was just short in a sprinkler head. So the player, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but he had a drop situation, and then he had to replace it, or he had then to place it. So when he places it, it's not going to stay there, it's going to roll down the hill. And what this is saying is you may have to move some distance away, but you're always going to stay in the general area. So if the nearest spot was in a bunker, you don't have to place it in the bunker. You stay in the same area of the course that you were in. The other situation that this comes up on is if you have a putting green with a false front, player hits his ball, it sticks on the false front. The player then marks his ball, he replaces, fixes the divot, the ball marker, then goes to replace the ball and it doesn't stay there. Then the player has to find the spot where it will stay. And it is often the case where the player will wind up finding a spot that is off the putting green because the green is so slanted that nothing will hold it. But that's fine. You move, you find the spot that will, the nearest spot where the ball will stay at rest. All right, 14.3. Dropping ball in relief area. Let's look at definition of drop at 332. To hold the ball and let go of it so that the ball falls through the air with the intent for the ball to be in play. We're going to come back to this, but notice the word with the intent for it to be in play. You can't accidentally drop a ball and have the ball become the ball in play. It's an intentional act. If a player lets go of a ball without intending it to be in play, the ball has not been dropped and it's not in play. Each relief rule identifies a specific relief area where the ball must be dropped and come to rest. In taking relief, the player must let go of the ball from a location at knee height so that the ball falls straight down without the player throwing, spinning, or rolling it, or using any other motion that might affect where the ball will come to rest. And it does not touch any part of the player's body before, and I would underscore the word before it hits the ground. As long as we're here, let's look at club length. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Club length, page 330. The length of the longest club of the 14 or fewer clubs the player has during the round, other than the putter. Notice the next sentence. A club length is a unit of measurement. Very interesting. It is a precise amount. When you start your round and you have a 43-inch driver in your bag, and that's the longest club other than your putter, every club length is 43 inches in that example. So notice that if you are up by the putting green and you're going to hit a shot with your wedge and you measure using your wedge and you drop the ball let's say your wedge is 35 inches long, you drop your ball 30 foot within the 35 inches and it rolls 3 inches outside of that, that ball would still be in the relief area because it's still within 43 inches of where you dropped it, because the club length is a unit of measurement. It's not the length of the particular club you chose to use for that particular relief procedure. 14.3, let's go through this. The rule applies whenever a player must drop a ball in taking relief under a rule, including when the player must complete taking relief by placing a ball under 14.3C2. If a player improves the relief area before or when dropping a ball, see 8.1. John covered that last week. Original ball or another ball may be used. The player may use the original ball or another ball. Notice the next sentence. This means that the player may use any ball each time they drop or place a ball under this rule. So in theory, you could have 5 or 6 balls on the course. You take your relief, you drop, the ball rolls outside, you get another ball, you drop again, it rolls outside, you get another ball, you place it, the ball rolls down the hill, you get another ball and you place it. This means each time you're dropping or taking relief, you can use a substitute ball. 14.3 B. Ball must be dropped in right way. The term here that we're going to talk about is a right way drop versus a wrong way drop. And a right way drop has 3 parts to it. Number 1, the player must drop the ball. The ball must be dropped only by the player. Neither the player's caddy nor anyone else may do so. Number 2, the ball must be dropped straight down from knee height without touching the player or the equipment. The player must let go of the ball from a location knee height so that the ball falls straight down. You can't spin it, roll it, to do anything else. It can't touch any part of the player's body or the equipment before it hits the ground. And there's a definition of knee height, which means knee height in a standing position. So, question, you are dropping your ball. You put a tee down, which is the 1 club length. When you drop the ball, you drop it and it hits the tee before it hits the ground. Have you dropped in the quote right way? No. Why? Because it has hit some part of your body or equipment. The tee is your equipment before the ball hit the ground. So you haven't dropped in the right way. We're going to see the ramifications of that in a minute. There's a diagram on 186 for those of you who don't know where your knee is. There you go. We won't go over that. Most of us have a pretty good idea of where our knee is. One thing to think about when you're doing this, however, if you're a rules official, especially for people who have on long pants as opposed to shorts, it is often hard to tell precisely where their knee is, but you do the best you can. And remember, a knee is probably 4 or 5 inches from the very bottom of the knee to the top of the knee. So anywhere in that is dropped from knee height. The third element of dropping in the right way, ball must be dropped in relief area. The ball must be dropped in the relief area. The player may stand either inside or outside when dropping it. And this is a change for 2023, the new language and the new back on the line. When taking back on the line relief, the ball must be dropped on the line in a location allowed by the rule, and the spot on which the ball is dropped creates a relief area. I would underscore the word creates and understand that if you don't drop on the line, you don't have a relief area because it is only created by dropping it on the line. All right, what to do if ball's dropped in the wrong way? So you have the 3 things that you're required to do. Parent 4 says, what do you do if you dropped it in a wrong way? I.e., you did one of those 3 things wrong. If the ball is dropped in the wrong way in breach of one or more of the requirements, the player must drop again in the right way, and there is no limit to the number of times the player must do so. Periodically, you'll see something on television where the player drops the ball, it rolls, they drop the ball, they roll, and then they drop it a third time. And you say to yourself, how could the person get 3 drops? The answer is there's no limit to the number of times you can drop if you drop it in the wrong way. So if you're supposed to drop it in the relief area and you drop it just outside, that doesn't count as one of your drops. If you do it a second time, that doesn't. And you drop it a third time, that doesn't count as one of the drops. If the player does not drop again and instead makes a stroke at a ball from where it came to rest after being dropped in a wrong way, then if the ball was played from the relief area, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. Why? Because they used the wrong procedure. But if the ball was played from outside the relief area, after it was placed when required to be dropped, then they're going to get the general penalty. Why? Because they played in the wrong, from the wrong place. So let's look at the 2 diagrams. Diagram number 1 on the next page, on page 188. These diagrams, and the one on 88 and 189, are very helpful to understand this concept. So notice in panel number 1, you have the player herself dropping the ball from knee height, and it drops in the relief area. So she has done all things right. She gets a green check mark because she's dropped in the right way. The second panel, it's the player. She's dropped from knee height, and she has dropped in the relief area. So notice the player in panel number 2 has dropped in the right way. We'll come back to that because there's a red check mark. Panel number 3, the player drops, it's the player, she drops from knee height, but she drops outside the penalty area. So she has a procedural error because she didn't drop in the right way. We just went over the fact that in the second panel, the player, if she plays from there, has played from a wrong place. She gets 2 penalty strokes. Panel number 3, the player has a procedural error. But notice that if she plays her ball from there, she will have played from the correct spot, the right spot. And she's only going to get 1 penalty stroke for her error. Now look at the diagram on the next page, diagram number 2. The first diagram, it's a player. He drops from knee height. He drops in the relief area, or I should say, he drops on the line, which then creates the relief area. So he gets a green check. Second paragraph, or the second diagram. The ball, it's the player. He's dropped from knee height. He drops on the line. Therefore, he has dropped correctly. He's dropped in the right way. Now he's going to get a red check mark, and we'll come back to that. Player in panel number 3. It's the player. He's dropped from knee height, but he has not dropped on the line. So that player has not dropped. He has used the wrong procedure, and he has not created a relief area. So what happens in panel number 2 when the player drops and then plays his ball from outside the circle? He's going to get the 2 penalty strokes because he played from the wrong place. Look at panel number 3. While it appears to be a procedural error, he's going to get 2-stroke penalty for playing from a wrong place. Why? Because when he dropped, he didn't drop on the line. If you don't drop on the line, you don't create a relief area. If there isn't a relief area, you can't play from within the relief area. So what does the player get? He gets a penalty for playing from the wrong place. All right. Let's go back to 14.3C. Ball dropped in right way must come to rest in the relief area. This is kind of what we went over, but let's do it again. This rule applies only when the ball is dropped in the right way under Rule 14.3C. Number 1, player has completed taking relief when the ball is dropped in the right way and comes to rest in the relief area. The ball must come to rest in the relief area. It does not matter whether the ball, after hitting the ground, touches any player, including the player, equipment, or other outside influence before coming to rest. So an example, the player drops, puts a tee down for 1 club length. He drops it, it hits the ground, hits the tee, stays in the relief area. What this is saying is he's completed taking relief. The fact that the ball hit his equipment after it hit the ground is irrelevant. He's proceeded correctly and on he goes. If the ball comes to rest in the relief area, the player has completed taking relief. If the ball comes to rest outside the relief area, the player must use the procedure in 14.3C, generally known as the drop, drop, place rule, which we're going to go over in a minute. In either case, there is no penalty to any player if a ball dropped in the right way accidentally hits any person, including the player, equipment, or outside influence before coming to rest. When ball dropped in right way is deliberately deflected by any person. So this shouldn't surprise you that there's going to be exception for a deliberate action. For what to do when the drop ball is deliberately deflected or stopped, we're going to look at 14.3D, which we'll look at in a minute. So let's first look at the drop, drop, place rule, which is 14.3C2. Another way to think about this rule, some people refer to it as the drop, drop, place rule. Another way, and I think a more accurate way to think about it, is the drop, drop, place, place, hunt rule. Well, let's go through that. What to do if ball dropped in right way comes to rest outside the relief area. The ball comes to rest outside the relief area. The player must drop a ball in the right way a second time. If the ball comes to rest outside the relief area, the player must then complete taking relief by placing a ball using the procedure for replacement. The player must place a ball on the spot where the ball dropped hits on the second time. If the placed ball does not stay at rest, the player must place a second time. So you got to drop a second time, then you got to place it, then you got to place it a second time. And here's the final paragraph. If the ball played a second time does not stay on the spot, the player must play a ball on the nearest spot where the ball will stay at rest, subject to the limitations of 14.2E. This might result in the ball being played from outside the relief area. So again, the way I think about this is it's the drop, drop, place, place, hunt rule. And those are the orders in which you have to have it. We had an interesting situation at the WIAA high school tournament. It's the second hole at Meadow Valley. It's a relatively short par 4. The second shot is severely uphill. The player hit the pin was in the front. The player hit the ball just short of the green. It embedded. We'll go over embedded ball rule next time, but it embedded. It was technically in the rough, but only 3 feet from the green. The player gets up there, and I only learn of these after the fact when I'm called over. But apparently the facts were that the player said, I get free relief from the embedded ball. The opposing coach said, no, you don't. You have to take unplayable ball relief. And the player says, well, I disagree, so I'm going to drop it in a relief area under the embedded ball rule. So the player then did it, and where he dropped the ball was in the spot that would be the proper spot for an embedded ball, and he dropped it in the fairway, which he is permitted to do. The ball hit, and of course, it went 50 feet down the hill. And the player says to himself, well, I know I got to drop a second time. Drop, drop, place, place, hunt. The opposing coach said, well, that's stupid because if you drop it a second time, it's going to roll all the way down the hill. Just place it there. So the kid did. He placed it. He chipped it on thinking that he got a 4. The opposing coach said you got a 5 because you got to take a penalty for the unplayable ball. Several holes later, I'm called over. Now you got both coaches, the player. So we go through the facts, just as I outlined. Does the player get a 4 in the hole? Does the player get a 5 on the hole? Or does the player get something else on the hole? And the answer is, the good news for the player is he was correct that he does get to take unplayable ball relief. The second piece of good news is he correctly dropped it in the spot, but the bad news is he didn't follow the drop, place, place rule. He didn't place it, he didn't drop it a second time. You say, well, so what? Well, if you look at the penalty statement under this section, it's actually on 190, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Penalty for playing ball from wrong place or playing ball that was placed instead of dropped in breach of 14.3 general penalty. So the player then wound up getting a 6 on the hole. He should have gotten a 4 or would have gotten a 4. So that's the drop, place, hunt rule. All right, 14.3D, D as in dog. What to do if ball dropped in right way is deliberately deflected. For purposes of this rule, the drop ball is deliberately deflected or stopped when, and this is the same as under Rule 11 that John went over, the person deliberately touches the ball in motion, or bullet point 2, a ball in motion hits any equipment or other object or any person, including the player and his caddy, that the player deliberately positioned, and as John pointed out, or left in a particular location so that the equipment, object, or person might deflect or stop the ball. So you're going to drop a ball. You don't want your ball to roll into a penalty area or a bunker or whatever, and then you place your club or something so that it doesn't. If you deliberately leave it there so that it hits it, you're going to get the penalty. All right, when a ball dropped in the right way is deliberately deflected, the player must drop a ball again when using the procedure in 14.3b, that's the right way, which means that the ball that was deliberately deflected or stopped does not count as one of the 2 drops, but you're going to get the 2-stroke penalty. If the ball was deliberately deflected or stopped by any person, the player gets a general penalty. All right, exception. When there is no reasonable chance the ball will come to rest in the relief area. If a ball dropped in the right way, deliberately deflected or stopped, whether in the relief area or outside the relief area, when there is no reasonable chance it will come to rest in the relief area, there is no penalty and the drop ball is treated as coming to rest outside. So this is sort of consistent within the what John went over before. You see this similar to the Jordan Spieth rule on the putting green. There's no reasonable chance. So if you're dropping on a severe slope, you drop it and the ball is clearly going outside the relief area and you happen to touch it or pick it up slightly before it exits the relief area, there's no penalty if there's no reasonable chance that it's going to come to rest in the relief area. Penalty statement, we've talked about that. Let's move on to 14.4. We covered this whenever we talked about, I guess that was last time with Rule 6.3. It is such an important concept and it's short. Let's go over it again. When player's ball is back in play after original ball was out of play. When a player's ball in play is lifted from the course or lost or out of bounds, the ball is no longer in play. The player has a ball in play again only when, and it's one of these 2 things, the player plays the original ball or another ball from the teeing area, or the original ball or another ball is replaced, dropped, or placed on the course, and this is the key, with the intent for that ball to be in play. Every time on the national exam, there's a question, something like the player picks up his ball from the putting green, marks it correctly, lifts it up, and then for some reason he just sets it aside because somebody else is going to putt. The player forgets that he had set it aside and he putts from that other location. And the question always says the player gets the penalty for playing from a wrong place. And the reason that that question is false is because the ball is not in play. Why? Because he didn't intend it to be in play. He just set it somewhere. If you just set a ball with no intent for it to be in play, the ball's not in play, the ball's a wrong ball. So the point of that question, which always shows up, is you need to understand that if a ball to be returned to the course under Rule 14 must be done with the intent for that ball to be in play. The last part of 14.4, if the ball is returned to the course in any way with the intent for it to be in play, the ball is in play, even if it was substituted for the original ball when not allowed, or replaced, dropped, or placed in a wrong place, wrong way, wrong procedure. All right, 14.5. Correcting mistake made in substituting, replacing, dropping, or placing ball. This is generally referred to as the eraser rule. Player may correct mistake before ball is played. So as the title of this rule indicates, we're going to go through the ability to correct a mistake, but the trigger point is before the ball is made or when the ball is made, played. Once the ball is played, you can't go back and correct one of these errors. When a player has substituted another ball for the original ball when not allowed under the rules, or the player's ball in play was replaced, dropped, or placed in a wrong way, wrong place, or by using the procedure that did not apply, the player may correct the mistake without penalty, but this is allowed only before the ball is played. Again, this is a short window to correct. You can't make a stroke and then say, oops, I dropped in the wrong way. One player may change to a different rule or relief option when correcting mistake in taking relief. Before we go over 14.5b, let me make a couple of comments. The USGA did a very nice job of rewording the wording in these to make it, in my view, much easier to understand. The other thing they did was that they flipped paragraph 1 and number 3. And the flipping of those two paragraphs was done because the USGA wanted to put these in the order that are the most likely to happen on the course. So when we go through these, you'll see that paragraph 1 is the most likely, paragraph 2 then the next likely, and paragraph 3 the least likely that is going to happen on the course. The last comment I want to make on this before we go through the specifics is the player must correct what he's got wrong, but he must keep what he has gotten right. So the flip side of that is whatever you got right, you got to keep it that way. And you correct what you got wrong. So let's go through these 3 positions and see how this plays out. Number 1, when ball was put in play under a rule that applied and was dropped or placed in the right way, but the rule requires ball to be dropped or placed again. In correcting this mistake, the player must go on to take relief using the same rule and the same relief option. Why? Because he played under the right rule, he played under the right relief option, but for some other reason he has to drop again. What's the standard thing why you have to drop again? The ball rolls out of the relief area. So you're taking penalty relief from a penalty area, you measure your 2 club lengths, you drop it correctly, the ball rolls a foot outside the 2 club length relief area. This is rule number 1 telling you, or sub 1 telling you, when you correct, you must stay under the same rule. My example was a penalty area, so that would be rule 17. The same relief option, which was the lateral relief option, and then you redrop. Example, when taking relief for an unplayable ball, which is rule 19, the player used the lateral relief option and the ball was dropped in the right relief area, but was dropped in a wrong way. In correcting the mistake, the player must go on to take relief under rule 19, the same rule because he got it right, and must use the same relief option, the lateral relief option, because he got it right. All right, let's look what happened, exception number, or paragraph number 2. When ball was put into play under a rule that applied, but ball was dropped or placed in a wrong place. In correcting this mistake, the player must go on to take relief under the same rule, but may use any relief option. Why? Because you have to keep what you got right. This player intended to proceed under Rule 19, the unplayable ball rule, but he didn't drop it in the right place. If you don't drop it in the right place, you didn't get that right. So let's look at this example. If a player is taking relief for an unplayable ball, the player used the lateral relief option, 19.2c, and mistakenly dropped the ball outside the required relief area. In correcting the mistake, the player must go on to take relief under 19.2 and may use any of the relief options under that rule. Why? Because he got the rule right, and that's all he got right. So then when he corrects, he can use any of the three options. He could go back on the line, or he could go stroke and distance. Parent 3, when ball put in play under a rule that did not apply. In correcting this mistake, the player may use any rule that applies, and that makes sense. The player did nothing right, so when you correct, you're not limited on what rule you can go under. And the example, if the player mistakenly took unplayable ball relief for their ball in a penalty area, which 19 does not allow, the player must correct the mistake by either replacing the ball if it had been lifted, or take penalty relief under Rule 17 and may use any of the relief options. So an example of that is your ball is in a penalty area. You then say, well, it's I can't really play it. And instead of taking penalty area relief, you take unplayable ball relief, you drop it within 2 club lengths. You have proceeded under a rule that does not apply. You cannot take unplayable ball relief from a penalty area. What this rule is saying, you can go on and correct by proceeding under any rule. And the rule that would apply would be the penalty area rule, which means you can go outside the penalty area rule and take any of the 3 options. Do you get your penalty stroke for taking penalty relief? Yes, you're going to get that 1 stroke penalty, but you've now corrected it. All right, last part of this rule, 14.5c. No penalty for actions taken after a mistake that related to the original ball. When a player corrects a mistake under 14.5a, any penalty for actions that were taken after the mistake and which relates solely to the original ball, such as accidentally causing it to move or improving the cats, do not count. So an example of that is your ball is in the penalty area. You incorrectly take unplayable ball relief in the penalty area. You drop within 2 club lengths. You then step on or move your ball. Well, that's a Rule 9.4 breach. What this is saying is you don't get that penalty for that if you then go on to properly correct. The but says if those same actions would also be a penalty for the ball put in play to correct the mistake, such as when those actions improve the conditions affecting the stroke for the ball now in play, the penalty applies to the ball now in play. And then the last part of this exception, this used to be in a clarification, it's now in the rule itself. In stroke play, if a player gets the general penalty for deliberately deflecting or stopping their ball under 14.3d, the player still gets the penalty even if the player dropped the ball again using the procedure. In other words, you can't, once you deliberately deflect your ball, you can't say, well, I'm now going to correct it and then erase that 2-stroke penalty for deliberately deflecting it. Let's look at 14.6. 14.6, making next stroke from where previous stroke made. This is one of those rules that you will see cross-referenced in almost every other rule in the book. It always says, and if you played from the wrong place, or blah, 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 see 14.6 as to how to get a ball back in play. So this is the rule that tells us it applies whenever a player is required or allowed under the rules to make the next stroke from where a previous stroke was made, such as when taking stroke and distance relief. Example would be hit your ball out of bounds. or playing again after a stroke has been canceled, such as Rule 6.4 in match play, playing out of turn, your opponent cancels the stroke, or otherwise does not count. An example of that is Rule 11 that John went over this morning. How the player must put a ball in play depends on the area of the course. In all of these situations, the player may either use the original ball or another ball. Why? Because they're taking relief. Anytime you take relief, you get to substitute balls, and 6.3 specifically says anytime you're making your stroke from where the previous stroke was made, you can substitute. 14.68, previous stroke made from the teeing area. The original ball or another ball must be played from anywhere inside the teeing area. So if you look at the next page, the drawing 14.6, common sense, anywhere in the teeing area means just that. You're not required to put it on the exact spot that you tee. You can do it anywhere in there. Look at the second panel. Your ball is played from the general area or a bunker or a penalty area. You are simply required then to play it from that spot. What is the reference point? The reference point where the previous stroke was made, if not known, must be estimated. So what is that getting at? So if your ball is in the rough 1 foot from the fairway and you hit your ball out of bounds, you have to make your next stroke from where your previous stroke was made. The reference point is where the previous stroke was made. So you go back, you find your divot hole, you look, that's the spot. Size of the relief area, 1 club length. Limitations, must be in the same area of the course, must be not near the hole. So in that situation, the relief area may allow you to move from the rough to the fairway. That's permitted under the rules. There was an interesting situation with Phil Mickelson a few years ago. His ball, of course, Phil's left-handed. The ball was on the left side of the fairway, very close to an out-of-bounds fence, I believe it was. His stroke was almost impossible to make because he was left-handed and his ball was right there. Anyways, Phil being Phil, he hit the ball out of bounds. Now he has to make his next stroke from where his previous stroke was made. The good news for Phil is the reference point is that same spot, but he now gets to move, because it's a relief area, he gets to move 1 club length away from the out of bounds fence and then was able to make a relatively normal shot. Last part of 14.6, previous stroke made from putting green. The original ball or another ball must be placed on the spot where the previous stroke was made, which if not known must be estimated. So on the putting green, you're going to place, I think most of us know that concept. All right, 14.7, playing from wrong place. Let's look at the definition of wrong place, 364. Wrong place. Any place on the course other than where the player is required or allowed to play their ball under the rules. Pretty straightforward. Examples. Again, this is a rule that gives you a very precise definition and then just gives you examples after this. Examples, playing a ball after replacing it on the wrong spot without replacing it when required. Playing a drop ball from outside the relief area. Taking relief under a wrong rule so that the ball is dropped and is played from a place not allowed. Playing a ball from a no play zone. And let's look at the last 2 bullet points. Notice that a player has not played from a wrong place in the following 2 situations. When the ball has been played from outside the teeing area in starting the play of a hole or in trying to correct that mistake. The reason that this is not a wrong place is because under 6.1b, the player is going to be disqualified. Why? Because it's not a serious breach. It's a playing from outside the teeing area, and we have the special teeing area rules. So they want to exclude that from wrong place, because if it was considered just a wrong place, If you were 1 foot in front of the teeing area when you started the hole, most people would say that's not a serious breach of playing from the wrong place. So it's there so that the player winds up getting a disqualification if they play from outside the teeing area in stroke play. Notice bullet point number 2. This was put into the rules in 2023, and it was put there so that you wouldn't get a disqualification. When a ball has been played from where it came to rest after the player has failed to replay a stroke. John went over this this morning under Rule 11. If you are required to replay your stroke, say on the putting green, you fail to do so, you tap it in. This is saying you haven't played from the wrong place, but you're going to wind up getting a general penalty for where you played from. And again, the reason for this is so that it eliminates the possibility of a disqualification. Last definition is serious breach. And that is on 3.359. Serious breach. In stroke play, when playing from a wrong place, could give the player a significant advantage compared to the stroke to be made from the right place. We're talking stroke play only. Why? Because in match play, if you play from a wrong place, it's a loss of hole, and there's nothing further to talk about. So in making the comparison to decide whether a breach is a serious breach, the factors to be taken into account include the difficulty of the stroke, the distance of the ball from the hole, the effect of the obstacles in the line of play, and the condition affecting the stroke. Normally, the distance the player gains is going to be the key. So if you drop your ball, if you hit a 200-yard drive and then you don't find it, you just say, well, I'll drop another ball right here. You have gained 200 yards. That's certainly going to be a serious breach. You can also get, the converse of that is if you are taking relief from a cart path and you drop it 2 club lengths rather than 1 club length, it's most unlikely that that is going to be a serious breach because you haven't gained any distance. However, these other 3 factors could come into effect. If the effect of you dropping 2 club lengths rather than 1 club length is that you now have a clear shot without having to hit from directly behind the tree, the committee could very well decide that that is a serious breach, even though you've only moved 1 or 2 yards away from where you should have been. All right, 14.7. Playing from where ball must be played. After starting a hole, a player must make each stroke from where their ball comes to rest, except when the rules require or allow it otherwise. A player must not play their ball in play from a wrong place. Penalty. Penalty for playing a wrong place in breach of 14.7a is the general penalty. Notice each time you make a stroke from a wrong play, you're going to get the general penalty. Each time. So if you hit your ball into a no play zone and you then play your shot, it goes a foot, and you play another shot and it goes another foot, and then you play your third shot and you hit it out, you're going to get 3 separate general penalties for playing from a wrong place. There's a clarification on this for those interested. It's 14.7b1. All right, so let's look at 14.7b. How to complete a hole after playing from wrong place in stroke play. Player must decide whether to play out the hole with the ball played from the wrong place or to correct the mistake by playing from the right place. What the player does next depends on whether it was a serious breach, that is, whether the player has gained a significant advantage. So if it's not a serious breach, the player must play out the hole with the ball played from the wrong place without correcting the mistake. Classic example of this is you're dropping from a cart path. You drop 2 club lengths rather than 1. You play your ball, and then somebody says to you, well, you played from the wrong place, you're supposed to drop it within 1 club length, you dropped it within 2. This is saying if it's not a serious breach, which most likely it would not be, you then finish the hole without correcting the mistake. Simply add the general penalty with 2 strokes to your score. Serious breach. The player must correct the mistake by playing out the hole with the ball played from the right place under the rules. This is the 4th must correct under the rules. If the player does not correct the mistake before making a stroke to begin another hole or for the final hole before returning their scorecard, the player is disqualified. So again, it's a must correct. What to do if you're uncertain whether the breach is serious? The player should play out the hole with both balls played from the wrong place and a second ball played from the right place under the rules. Player who plays 2 balls must report to the committee. If the player is uncertain whether playing from the wrong place was a serious breach and decides to play a second ball and trying to correct the mistake, the player must report the fact to the committee, even if you score the same with both balls. This applies, just remember that. If player does not report the facts to the committee, they are disqualified. Normally, if any of you are doing scoring, one of the questions you should always ask somebody before they turn in the scorecard is, did you play 2 balls? It's never happened to me, but I'm waiting for the player to say, yes, I played 2 balls, but I got the same score, and then there's no reason to report. Well, yes, there is a reason to report because the rules require you to report even if you got the same score. And by asking that question, you may then eliminate the possibility that the person will be disqualified. When player plays 2 balls, committee will decide the player's score. The player's score depends on whether the committee decides there was a serious breach in playing the original ball from the wrong place. No serious breach, the score of the ball played from the wrong place counts, and the player gets the general penalty. All strokes with the second ball played don't count. That makes sense. Let's look at serious breach. The score with the ball played to correct the mistake or played from a wrong place account, the player gets the general penalty, which means 2 penalty strokes are added to the score. The score made in playing the original ball from the wrong place and any more strokes with that ball, including strokes made in any penalty strokes, do not count. Here's the troublesome one. If the player if the ball played to correct the mistake was also played from the wrong place, so you've got 2 balls played from the wrong place. The first one is a serious breach. You know at a minimum the person's going to get 4 penalty strokes because they've now played 2 balls from the wrong place. If that second ball that they played was also from a wrong place, serious breach, the player has no score for the hole. If you have no score for the hole in stroke play, the player is disqualified. And that is it for Rule 14. Yeah, 14.
Rule. Seeing any questions online? Anyone?
Good.
Questions in here?
Perfect.
Perfect. All right. Dan's gonna move to 15.
All right, moving on to Rule 15. Rule 15 deals with the starting of the relief, the rules that govern relief. Rule 14 is the procedures. Now we're getting into not the how, but the why and when you're allowed to take relief. The difference between Rule 15 and Rule 16, which we'll get into next week, both of them are relief procedures, but in 15, generally speaking, you're moving the object that is causing the issue. When we get to Rule 16, we're going to be seeing that you're going to move your ball to a different place in taking relief. So let's look at the purpose statement of 15. Rule 15 covers when and how the player may take free relief from loose impediments and movable obstructions. These movable, natural, and artificial objects are not treated as part of the challenge playing the course, and a player is normally allowed to move them when they are interfering with play. Again, notice the word normally, we'll have some exceptions. And the key here is that loose impediments and movable obstructions are not part of the challenge of playing the game. If they're not part of the challenge of playing the game, common sense would suggest you can move them if they're in your way. Rule 15, let's start with the definition of loose impediments, and that's on page 341. Definition page 341, loose impediment, any unattached natural objects. You put a period there, that's the end of the definition. The rest are examples. Notice the next words, such as, and then we have a whole list. We're going to go over these, but understand the definition of loose impediment is any unattached natural object. So let's look at the such as stones, loose grass, leaves, branches, sticks, dead animals, animal waste, worms, insects, similar animals that can be removed easily, and the mounds and webs they built. Notice an anthill is a mound or cast made by a loose impediment, made by an insect. Clumps of compact dirt. Such natural objects are not loose, and this is an internal definition to tell us what the definition of loose means. They are not loose, and thus will not be a loose impediment, if they're attached or growing, they're solidly embedded in the ground, sticking to the ball. So a player looks down, he sees on their ball a blade of grass. Is that sticking to the ball? Yes, it's not a loose impediment. Notice that the term solidly embedded in the ground, a way to know when something is solidly embedded is to think the concept, and the USGA normally speaks of it in this way, and it's a good way to remember it. Think of it as, is the earth holding back the object when you try to remove it? So if you have a 10-pound stone, it may be hard to pick up, but is the earth holding it back? Well, if it isn't, then it's a loose impediment. On the other hand, you can have a 1 2-inch diameter stone that when you go to pick it up, you can't get it out of the ground because the earth is holding it back. Normally, a person can pick up a 1-inch stone without, you have the strength to do it, but notice that that is not a loose impediment if the earth is holding it back when you try and remove it. Special cases. Sand and loose soil are not loose impediments. This does not include mound built by worm, insect, or similar animal. We had an interesting situation at the state amateur at Sand Valley. I believe it's the 4th hole. One of the top players hit their second shot, it's a par 5, up by just behind the green, and he wanted to putt it. And on his line were 3 or 4 ant hills and then some loose sand. And he asked me whether he could move the ant hills. And I said, yes, because they're loose impediments. But you can't move the soil or the sand that was otherwise laying there, even though you would argue, well, isn't it the same thing? And the answer is no, it's not the same thing, because one is part of the cast made by the insect, the other is just sand and loose soil. Other special cases, dew, frost, and water are not loose impediments. Snow and natural ice, other than frost, you got to choose. They're either loose impediments, or when they're on the ground, temporary water. If they're temporary water, you're going to get relief under Rule 16. Spider webs. This is always on the national exam. Your first reaction when you see a spider web is, of course, it's attached. And it is attached. But this is a special case. Spider webs are loose impediments, even though they are attached. Why is that? Because it's the cast of an insect. It's no different in the rules of golf's eyes than an anthill, that the cast of an anthill. The fact that the spider actually attaches it to a tree doesn't detract from the fact that it's still a quote loose impediment. And then live insect on a ball, you see this all the time on television. The little bug or whatever it is flies on the ball, and the player is always trying to get it to go away by various actions. That bug, if it's live, is a loose impediment. Another definition to look at is obstruction, 351. Obstruction, any artificial object. Again, you put a period there, that's the definition of obstruction, an artificial object. Then it says except, and this is an exception, integral objects, boundary objects, and paint dots and lines. It's at the bottom of the page. And the rest of this are just examples of what constitutes an obstruction. And all of these are artificial objects. Roads, buildings, sprinkler heads, stakes, golf carts, waste, blah, blah, blah. An obstruction is either a movable obstruction or an immovable obstruction. If part of the immovable obstruction, such as a gate or part of an attached cable, meets the definition of movable obstruction, that part is treated as a movable obstruction. Some examples of that could be a sprinkler head with the hose stuck in it, and the player cannot get the hose out of the sprinkler head because it's attached in some fashion and you need a special device to get it out. But then you have the rest of the hose wherever it is. You could move the hose because that part of the obstruction is the movable part. A gate in a fence that's not a boundary fence, the gate would be considered movable because that part is movable. A couple of other examples to keep in mind is if the object is not intended, take the example of a rock wall. West Bend has some interesting rock walls. What's the other one down there? Washington County has a rock wall. These may be integral objects. They may not be. They may be immovable obstructions. You cannot move the rock on top of those because they were not intended to be moved. They are part of the and are intended not to be moved, even though they would be considered movable. The rules are going to treat those as immovable. All right, lastly, 345, let's look at movable obstruction. An obstruction that can be moved with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the course. If part of a movable obstruction or an integral object, such as a gate, door, or attached cable, meets the two definitions, that part is treated as movable. But this does not apply if the movable part of a movable obstruction is not meant to be moved. And an example of that is a loose stone that is part of the stone wall in those examples. But notice that if you have a stone wall and a rock falls off and is laying in the rough, that stone as it lays there is a movable obstruction, even though it's because it's no longer part of the movable rock wall. All right, let's press on. Rule 15. We covered the purpose statement. Let's look at 15.1, removal of loose impediments. And notice 15.1 is loose impediments, 15.2 is movable obstructions. They are almost similar construction, but the difference between those is if you move a loose impediment, there's a risk factor because you may get a penalty if you cause your ball to move, whereas with movable obstructions, we don't have that risk factor. 15.1a, without penalty, a player may remove a loose impediment anywhere on or off the course and may do so in any way such as by using a hand or a foot, using a club or other equipment, getting help from others, or breaking off part of a loose impediment. That last part of that sentence was previously in interpretations or clarifications. Now it is a nice addition to the rules themselves. So if you have a large tree branch that has broken off and is completely detached from a tree, that branch is a loose impediment. You can get help if you're not strong enough or you're not able to move it. Others can help you out. And you could break off part of it if just a small part of the branch interferes. You can do that. Two exceptions. Removing loose impediment when ball must be replaced. Before replacing a ball that was lifted or moved from anywhere on the course except the putting green. So we're going to go over this, but understand this applies only to when replacing a ball. It does not apply to dropping or placing a ball. The way to think of this is you have a ball in the center of the fairway. Your ball came to rest on a divot, not a divot hole, but a divot itself. You can't move that loose impediment if it then causes that ball to move. So let's go through this exception. A player must not deliberately move a loose impediment that, if moved before the ball was lifted or moved, would have been likely to have caused the ball to move. If the player does so, they get one penalty, but the removed loose impediment does not need to be replaced. So again, the point of this is it's only when you are required to replace a ball. So if your ball is in the middle of the fairway and you would be standing on a sprinkler head and you decide to take relief, can you move loose impediments where you're going to drop? Yes, because loose impediments are not part of conditions affecting stroke. What this is saying is, if you're going to replace the ball, an example would be you're walking down the fairway and you accidentally kick your ball. You are then required to replace the ball, and when you replace it, you have to replace it on the spot. And that means you have to set it on, in my example, the divot or the large leaf that was sitting there. This exception applies both during a round and while play is stopped under Rule 5.7. It does not apply to a loose impediment that was not there before the ball was lifted or moved, or that is moved as a result of marking the ball. So you lift your ball, your ball's kicked, you're going to replace the ball. As you go to replace it on the spot, a leaf magically shows up in the spot where you have to replace it. What this is saying, does not apply to that loose impediment that was not there before the ball was lifted. Exception 2, restrictions on deliberately removing loose impediments to affect ball in motion. John went over that this morning. 15.1b, here's the risk factor in this rule with loose impediments. If a player's removal of a loose impediment causes their ball to move, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. If the moved ball at rest anywhere except on the putting green or the teeing area, the player gets one penalty stroke under 9.4b. And there's, of course, the exception for searching for a ball. Let's look at the movable obstruction rule. This rule covers free relief that is allowed from artificial objects that meet the definition of movable obstruction. It does not give free relief from immovable obstruction, which we're going to see under Rule 16, or boundary objects or integral objects. These last two, you get no free relief. Relief from movable obstructions. Without penalty, the player may remove a movable obstruction anywhere off the course and may do so in any way. An example, a classic example is your ball is up against a bunker rake. You pick up the rake, you can move it, the ball moves, you put it back, no penalty. Normally, you're going to want to mark the spot because your goal is to get it back, but that's not a requirement. The two exceptions. Tee markers must not be moved when ball will be played from tee. A caution, anytime you have a rule that refers you to a specific rule, you're going to want to read that specific rule rather than relying on the language in this general statement. So it says tee markers must not be moved when ball would be played from teeing area. We went over this last week. The penalty under that 6.2b4 deals with moving it for purposes of making your stroke, and therefore you have improved the conditions affecting the stroke. Exception 2, restrictions on deliberately removing a move obstruction to affect a ball. Again, that's the same one that John removed this morning. If a player's ball moved while they're removing a loose impediment, no penalty. The ball must be replaced on its original spot, which if not known must be estimated. Can you clean the ball when you're putting it back? The answer is yes. Why? Because you've lifted your ball and it's not under one of those 4 exceptions. Parent 2. Relief when ball is in or on movable obstruction anywhere on the course except on putting. The player may take free relief by lifting the ball, removing the move obstruction, and dropping the original ball or another ball in this relief area. The reference point, estimated point right under where the ball is at rest. The size 1 club length, and it must be in the same area of the course as the reference point, must not be near the hole. So example of that is diagram 2 on page 209. The ball is lying on it looks like a towel. The player lifts the towel. The reference point is that spot right under it, and the club length is the relief area. Relief when ball is on movable obstruction on putting green. Notice that the spot or the reference point is identical. The only difference is you do not, on the putting green, you're not going to get a relief area and drop the ball, you're going to place it. 15.2b, relief for ball not found or in or on movable obstruction. If the player's ball has not been found and it's known or virtually certain it came to rest in or on a movable obstruction, the player may use this release option instead of taking stroke and distance. So anytime the rules refer to the word may, that means it's not required. And you actually have a choosy in the situation. An example of this, not very common, but if you have a large waste bucket on a course, a ball could wind up going into that waste bucket. Is that thing movable? Yeah, you can pick it up. But the rule is saying you're not required to. If you can't find your ball by looking in there, you can take stroke and distance relief because your ball's lost. Or the player may take free relief using the estimated point right under where the ball last crossed the edge of the movable obstruction as a reference point. Why don't you use the spot directly under where the ball is? Because you don't know what that spot is. So what this is telling you is you assume that the ball is where it last crossed the edge of the movable obstruction. That then is your reference point, and you can move the movable obstruction and then drop in the relief area. Once a player puts another ball in play to take relief, the original ball is no longer in play, and this is true even if it's then found on the course. If it's not known or virtually certain that the ball came to rest in or on a movable obstruction, the player must take stroke and distance. In other words, you got to have KVC, known or virtually certain that the ball is in the movable obstruction. All right, last section, 15.3. Ball or ball marker, helping or interfering with play. The breakdown of this rule is interesting because the first one, 15.3a, deals with ball on putting green helping play. If the ball is not on the putting green, you cannot have a situation of helping play. So if the question is it helping play, it's only going to be under 15.3 A, not under the other rules. 15.3A applies only to a ball that rests on the putting green, not anywhere else. If a player reasonably believes that the ball on the putting green might help anyone, such as serving as a possible backstop near the hole, the player may mark the spot of the ball, lift it under 13.1B if that's their own ball, or if the other ball belongs to another player, require. So underscore the word require the other player to mark the spot and lift the ball. You have the absolute right, if you think a ball is going to help somebody else, to require that other player to mark it. The lifted ball must be replaced on its original spot. Now we have a stroke play only item. A player who is required to lift the ball may play first instead. And if two or more players agree to leave a ball in place to help any player, and the player then makes a stroke with the helping ball left in place, each player who made the agreement gets the general penalty. This applies even if the two people do not know that this is a breach of the rules. What happens if the two players do know that this is a breach of the rules? Answer, they're both disqualified. Why? Because that's what 1.3b1 says. If two players agree to deliberately breach the rules that they know apply, are going to be disqualified. So why is this stroke play only? Because in match play, you can actually leave a ball in place to help someone else. It's the other player's objection. If he doesn't want it there, if the player doesn't want it there, they can move it. Match play is different because it affects only those players. Notice that if it's a 4-ball and the two ABs decide that they want to leave the ball in place, CD can require them to lift it because that's their right as provided under 15.3A. Meaning of interference. Interference under this rule exists when another player's ball at rest might interfere with the player's area of intended stance or swing, is on or close to the player's line of play such that given the intended stroke, there's a reasonable chance that the player's ball in motion could hit it, or is close enough to distract the player in making the stroke. So notice this last part of the definition of interference means that mental interference is reason enough to require somebody else to lift their ball. Mental interference will do that. When relief is allowed from interfering ball, if a player reasonably believes that another player's ball anywhere on the course might interfere with the player's own play, the player may require the other player to mark the spot and lift the ball, and the ball must not be cleaned except when lifted from the putting green. If the other player does not mark the spot before lifting the ball or clean the ball when not allowed, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. In stroke play only, the player required to lift their ball under this rule may play first. This always comes up on the national exam. In match play, you can't play first just because of this lifting ball concept. A player is not allowed to lift their ball under this rule based only on the player's own belief that the ball might interfere with another player. This is a rather tricky situation, and it comes up not infrequently. Two players hit their ball in the middle of the fairway. They're 6 inches apart. Player A's ball is the ball farthest away. The concern you have is that player B simply walks up, picks up his ball, thinking that the other player is going to want it. Oh, if you do that, it's a 1-stroke penalty and you got to put it back. As a rules official, I sort of make it a practice when I see that happening to kind of move close to the players. And as they get there, if no one has said anything, I suggest, are you going to want that ball moved? And if one of the players says yes, and then I say, well, don't lift it until the other one requests that you lift the ball. Because you do not have the right to lift your ball solely because you think it might interfere with someone else's play. That is the right of the other player to make that request. All right, 15.3C. ball marker helping or interfering with play. If a ball marker might help or interfere with play, the player may move the ball marker out of the way, or if the ball marker belongs to another player, require that player to move the ball out of the way for the same reasons that may require a ball to be lifted under the rule. Notice that a ball marker can be on the putting green, but doesn't say the putting. If a ball marker might help or interfere, the player may move the ball. Notice that if it's a ball, you can't move it just because it's going to interfere. It's a strange, I shouldn't say it's a strange difference, but it is a difference, a subtle difference, and you should understand that a ball marker can be moved even if the player thinks it might interfere, whereas a ball cannot be moved solely on the player's own belief that it might interfere. The ball marker belongs to another player, require the player to move the ball out of the way for the same reasons as they may require a ball to be lifted under 15. The ball marker must be moved out of the way to a new spot measured from its original spot, such as by using one or more club links. When moving a ball marker back, the player should do the same measure from the new spot and reverse the steps. The key here is that you are not required to use a specific technique for moving your ball. The rules simply require the ball that is moved to get back into the same spot. The best practice is to have a standard procedure that you always use, such as putting the ball marker down, then using the club head, then moving the ball marker so that you can reverse it. You are not obligated to do that. You just have to get the ball back in the right spot. All right, this penalty also applies if the player makes a stroke without waiting for a helping ball or ball marker to be lifted or moved after becoming aware that another player intended to lift or move the ball or had required someone else to do so. In other words, if you know someone else is going to move their ball, you can't quickly play and thereby deprive that other person of the ability to move it. Or you cannot refuse to lift their ball or the ball marker when required to do so, and a stroke is then made by the other player whose play might have been helped or interfered. Penalty for violating this, wrong place, breach of 15.3, general penalty for playing from the wrong place. Question 15.
Not seeing anything here. Dan's ready to be done.
If that is it for question 15. Thank you all for your attendance, and we'll see you next time, and we'll have whatever 16 through whatever.
We'll be meeting next Thursday, February 2nd, starting at 8:30 again, and we'll send out information with that meeting. So again, like Dan said, thanks to Dan and John for joining, teaching this week, and we look forward to seeing everybody next Thursday or joining us online. Have a great rest of your day.